Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the fjord lay silent under the heavy blanket of morning mist, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant gull. Ragnar Lothbrok, barely a man by the reckoning of his people, crouched at the water's edge. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a war drum urging him forward. The village elder's words echoed in his mind. Only a true warrior can slay the beast that plagues our lands. Ragnar's fingers tightened around the haft of his axe. The weapon, a gift from his father, felt both comforting and woefully inadequate. What use was steel against scales that could turn aside the sharpest blade? A disturbance in the water caught his eye. Something massive moved beneath the surface, sending ripples across the glassy fjord. Ragnar's breath caught in his throat as an enormous serpentine head breached the surface, water cascading from scales the size of shield bosses. "Jormungandr's bastard child," Ragnar whispered, invoking the name of the world serpent. The beast's eyes, yellow as harvest moons, fixed upon him with predatory intent. Time seemed to slow as man and monster regarded each other. Then, with a roar that shook the very mountains, the serpent lunged. Ragnar dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as massive jaws snapped shut mere inches from where he had stood. The young Viking rolled to his feet, axe at the ready. "Come on, you overgrown worm," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and bravado. "I'll send you back to hell herself." The serpent's head whipped around, its long neck coiling like a spring. Ragnar knew he had only one chance. As the beast struck again, he leapt forward, directly into the path of its attack. At the last possible moment, he dropped to his knees, sliding on the wet stones of the shore. The serpent's head passed over him, and Ragnar swung his axe with all his might. The blade bit deep into the creature's throat, black blood spraying forth in a torrent. The serpent thrashed in its death throes, its massive body churning the fjord into a froth. Ragnar held on to his embedded axe for dear life, pulled this way and that, as the beast's life ebbed away. When at last the serpent lay still, Ragnar stood shakily, his legs barely supporting him. He was soaked to the bone, covered in blood, both his and the monster's. His breeches, hastily fashioned from the hide of a bear he had slain the previous winter, were matted with gore and hanging in tatters. As the mist began to clear, villagers cautiously approached the scene of battle. Murmurs of awe swept through the gathering crowd. "By the gods," one man exclaimed, "he's done it. The boy has slain the beast." An old woman cackled, pointing a gnarled finger at Ragnar. "Look at his legs, hairy as a bear and twice as fierce. Lothbrok, we shall call him. Ragnar Lothbrok." And so a legend was born. Years passed, and Ragnar's fame grew. Tales of his exploits spread throughout the Norse lands, attracting both admirers and challengers. None, however, captured his attention quite like Lagertha. The shield maiden's beauty was matched only by her ferocity in battle. Men twice her size learned to fear the flash of her sword and the glint in her eye. Ragnar was smitten from the moment he first saw her split a man's skull in twain. "I would have you as my wife," Ragnar declared one day, approaching Lagertha as she trained with her fellow shield maidens. Lagertha lowered her shield, eyeing Ragnar with a mix of amusement and disdain. "And why should I accept, Lothbrok? Because you killed a snake? I've gutted men who posed far greater threat." Ragnar grinned, undeterred. "Then let us settle this as warriors. If I best you in combat, you'll be my wife. If you win, I'll be your thrall for a year and a day." A ripple of excitement passed through the onlookers. Lagertha's eyes narrowed, considering the offer. Then, quick as lightning, she swung her sword at Ragnar's head. The battle that ensued became the stuff of legend. For hours they fought, neither willing to yield. Swords clashed, Shields splintered, and blood flowed freely. As the sun began to set, both warriors stood panting, battered but unbowed. Lagertha, her blonde hair matted with sweat and blood, lowered her weapon. "Enough," she said, a note of respect in her voice. "You've proven your worth, Ragnar Lothbrok. I will be your wife." Ragnar's laugh boomed across the training ground. "And I, my love, will be your husband. Together we shall carve our names into the very fabric of history." The longship's dragon-headed prow cut through the fog like a knife, revealing the green shores of England. Ragnar stood at the bow, his eyes gleaming with the promise of glory and plunder. "There it is, my friends," he called out to his crew. "A land ripe for the taking. The Anglo-Saxons grow fat and lazy on their Christian God. Let us remind them of the old ways of blood and iron." A cheer went up from the Vikings, the sound carrying across the water like thunder. As they beached their ships, the first rays of dawn broke through the mist. And with them came fire and sword. The monastery at Lindisfarne stood no chance against the fury of the Northmen. Monks fell by the score, their prayers to their foreign god going unanswered. Ragnar himself led the charge, his axe rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. "Please," a young monk begged, cowering before the Viking leader. "In the name of Christ, show mercy." Ragnar paused, looking down at the trembling man. For a moment pity flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold certainty of his purpose. "Your Christ hangs on a cross," Ragnar said softly. "Our gods swing the hammer and the axe. Tell me, little monk, which seems the stronger to you now?" The axe fell, and with it, the last vestige of the old world. The age of Vikings had truly begun. In the years that followed, Ragnar's fame grew, as did his family. Sons were born to him and Lagertha, each one a promise of future greatness. Bjorn, the eldest, showed his father's strength and his mother's cunning from an early age. By the time he could walk, he was already swinging a wooden sword with surprising skill. Ubi, the second son, was quieter but no less fierce. His eyes held a wisdom beyond his years, and Ragnar often found the boy studying maps and asking questions about far-off lands. Hvitserk came next, a ball of endless energy and mischief. He could climb like a squirrel and swim like a fish, always seeking the next adventure. Sigurd Snake in the Eye was born with a mark in his eye, a sign the seers claimed foretold great destiny. He grew to be a skilled musician, his songs stirring the hearts of warriors before battle. And then there was Ivar. Born with twisted, useless legs, many whispered that he should have been left to the wolves. But Ragnar saw the fire in the boy's eyes, a cunning that surpassed even his own. "My sons," Ragnar would say, gathering them around the hearth fire, "each of you is a weapon forged by the gods themselves. Together, you will shake the very foundations of the world." It was on a cold winter's night, with the wind howling outside like a pack of hungry wolves, that the seer came to Ragnar's hall. The ancient man, his eyes long since sewn shut, moved with an otherworldly grace that belied his years. "Ragnar Lothbrok," the seer intoned, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "I have seen your destiny written in the branches of Yggdrasil itself." The hall fell silent, every eye fixed upon the wizened figure. Ragnar leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, seer, what do the gods have in store for me and mine?" The seer's head tilted, as if listening to voices only he could hear. "Your name, Ragnar, will echo through the ages. Kings will tremble at the mention of Lothbrok. Your sons, your sons will carve empires from the bones of the old world." A murmur ran through the gathered warriors. Ragnar's eyes gleamed in the firelight, a mixture of pride and hunger evident in his gaze. "But beware," the seer continued, his tone growing ominous. "For with great destiny comes great peril. The higher you climb, Ragnar Lothbrok, the further you have to fall, and fall you shall, in a pit of serpents far from home." A chill ran through the hall, colder than any winter wind. Ragnar stood, his face a mask of determination. "If that is to be my fate, then so be it. But before I fall, I shall rise higher than any man has before. My sons will be kings, and their sons after them. The name Lothbrok will be carved into the very stones of history." As if in answer to his declaration, a great boom of thunder shook the hall. The assembled Vikings roared their approval, raising horns of mead in salute to their leader. The great hall of Kattegat buzzed with activity, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and spilled mead. Ragnar Lothbrok sat at the head of the long table, his piercing blue eyes scanning the faces of his warriors and kinsmen. The raids on England had brought wealth and fame to his people, but a restlessness gnawed at him, a hunger for something more. As the night wore on, and the tales grew taller with each round of drinks, an old seafarer named Floki leaned in close to Ragnar, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Have you heard, my lord?" Floki whispered, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Of the lands that lie far to the east?" Ragnar's interest piqued. "What lands do you speak of, Floki? We know of the Saxons and the Franks, but what lies beyond?" Floki's grin widened. "O lands of untold riches, my lord. Cities with towers that scrape the sky, palaces adorned with gold and precious stones. They say the rulers there wear silk as fine as a spider's web and wield swords that can cut through iron like butter." Ragnar leaned back, his mind awhirl with possibilities. "And how do you know of these lands, old friend? Have you seen them with your own eyes?" Floki cackled, shaking his head. "Not I, but I've spoken with traders who've ventured far into the east. They speak of great rivers that lead to seas as vast as oceans, and of people with customs strange beyond imagining." As Ragnar pondered these tales, a commotion at the entrance to the hall caught his attention. A stranger stood in the doorway, his clothes unlike any Ragnar had seen before. The man's dark beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore a long coat of finely woven wool embroidered with intricate patterns. "Who are you, stranger?" Ragnar called out, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. The man bowed deeply. "I am Oleg, a humble trader from the city of Novgorod. I bring greetings and gifts from lands far to the east." Intrigued, Ragnar motioned for Oleg to approach. The trader laid out his wares on the table, silks softer than any fabric Ragnar had ever felt, spices that filled the air with exotic aromas, and intricate jewelry crafted with a skill that surpassed even the finest Norse craftsmen. "Tell me of your homeland, Oleg of Novgorod," Ragnar demanded, his eyes never leaving the treasure before him. Oleg smiled, sensing the Viking lord's curiosity. "Novgorod is but one jewel in a land of many wonders, Lord Ragnar. To the south lies Kiev, a city of golden domes and bustling markets, and beyond that, the great city of Miklagard, which the Greeks call Constantinople. It is said that the wealth of 100 kingdoms flows through its streets." As Oleg spun tales of distant lands and untold riches, Ragnar felt a fire ignite within him. The lure of the unknown, the promise of glory and wealth beyond imagining. It called to him like the song of the Valkyries. Unnoticed by his father, young Bjorn Ironside stood in the shadows, drinking in every word. The boy's heart raced with excitement, visions of adventure filling his mind. As the night wore on and plans began to form in Ragnar's mind, Bjorn could contain himself no longer. He approached his father, standing tall despite his youth. "Father," Bjorn said, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt, "I wish to join you on your next expedition." Ragnar turned to his son, surprise evident on his face. "You? But you're barely more than a boy, Bjorn. The journey east will be fraught with dangers we've never faced before." Bjorn's jaw set stubbornly. "I am a son of Ragnar Lothbrok and Lagertha the Shield Maiden. I have Viking blood in my veins. I am ready to face whatever challenges lie ahead." Pride swelled in Ragnar's chest, but before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the hall. "No." Lagertha strode forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Absolutely not." Ragnar sighed, knowing the battle that was to come. "Lagertha, my love, perhaps we should discuss this in private." The Shield Maiden's glare could have melted iron. "There is nothing to discuss. You cannot be serious about this madness, Ragnar. Sailing into unknown lands based on the tales of a stranger? And now you would risk our son's life as well? Mother, please, Bjorn interjected, but a sharp look from Lagertha silenced him. Ragnar stood facing his wife. The gods have shown us a path to greatness, Lagertha. We cannot ignore their will. The gods? Lagertha scoffed. Or your own restless ambition. You have wealth, power, and fame. Is that not enough? It will never be enough, Ragnar said softly, his eyes distant. Not while there are still horizons to chase, worlds to discover. This is who I am, Lagertha, who we are as a people. The argument raged long into the night, their voices echoing through the halls of Kattegat. Bjorn listened from his bed, torn between his desire for adventure and the fear he saw in his mother's eyes. In the end, Ragnar's will prevailed, as it always did. The preparations for the eastern expedition began in earnest. Ships were readied, provisions gathered, and warriors selected for the perilous journey. On the day of departure, the beaches of Kattegat were alive with activity. Ragnar stood at the prow of his ship, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. Lagertha approached, her face a mask of worry and resignation. "You're really doing this," she said, more a statement than a question. Ragnar turned to her, taking her hands in his. "I must, my love. The gods have set us on this path." Lagertha's grip tightened. "Then come back to me, Ragnar Lothbrok. Swear it." "I swear by Odin's eye and Thor's hammer," Ragnar said solemnly. "I will return to you." As they embraced, Bjorn approached, his young face set in determination. "Father, I'm ready. My axe is sharp and my arm is strong." Ragnar looked at his son, seeing in him the same fire that burned in his own heart. For a moment he was tempted to bring the boy along to show him the wonders that awaited, but the fear in Lagertha's eyes stayed his hand. "Not this time, my son," Ragnar said, placing a hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "Your time will come, I promise you. But for now, you must stay and protect your mother and our people." Disappointment and anger flashed across Bjorn's face. "But father—" "No buts," Ragnar said firmly. "This is my decision. Prove to me that you're ready by obeying it." Bjorn's jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. "Yes, father." As Ragnar boarded his ship, he took one last look at his family. Lagertha stood proud and strong, ever the shield maiden, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Bjorn's face was a storm of emotions, anger, disappointment, and a burning desire for adventure. "Farewell, my family," Ragnar called out as the ships began to move. "When I return, it will be with tales of wonders beyond imagining and riches to make Kattegat the envy of the Norse world." The crowd cheered, but Bjorn remained silent, his eyes fixed on the departing fleet. As the ships disappeared into the misty horizon, he made a silent vow. One day, he would sail those same waters, chasing the horizon just like his father. One day, he would make the name Ironside as feared and respected as Lothbrok. But for now he was left behind, watching the sea and dreaming of the adventures that awaited in the mysterious lands to the east. The longships creaked and groaned as they pushed upstream, fighting against the swift current of the Dnieper River. Ragnar Lothbrok stood at the prow of the lead vessel, his keen eyes scanning the densely forested shoreline for any sign of danger. They had left the familiar waters of the Baltic Sea behind weeks ago, venturing into a realm as mysterious as it was perilous. "Oars!" Ragnar bellowed as the roar of rapids filled the air ahead. "Full strength, men! The gods favor the bold!" The Vikings strained at their oars, muscles bulging as they fought against nature itself. The first ship made it through, then the second. But as the third vessel entered the churning waters, a sickening crack echoed across the river. The ship's hull had struck a hidden rock, tearing a gash in its side. "To the shore," Ragnar commanded, watching helplessly as the stricken ship began to list. Most of the crew made it to safety, but several were swept away by the merciless current, their cries fading into the distance. As night fell, the fleet made camp on a small island in the middle of the river. The mood was somber as they tended to their wounded and mourned their lost comrades. "This land tests us, brother," Rollo, Ragnar's imposing sibling, muttered as he joined him by the fire. "Perhaps we should turn back while we still can." Ragnar's eyes flashed in the firelight. "Turn back? And forfeit the glory that awaits us? No, Rollo. We press on. The gods did not bring us this far to abandon us now." Little did Ragnar know that as he spoke those words, unseen eyes were watching from the forest, evaluating the strange invaders who had entered their domain. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. As the Vikings prepared to resume their journey, a shout went up from one of the lookouts. "Movement on the shore! Armed men approaching!" Ragnar grabbed his shield and axe, barking orders to his warriors. "Form up! Be ready for anything, but do not attack unless I command it." From the tree line emerged a group of men, their dress and weapons unlike anything the Norse had seen before. At their head strode a tall man with a thick beard and piercing green eyes. "I am Sviatoslav," the man called out in halting Norse. "Who leads this band of strangers in our lands?" Ragnar stepped forward, his presence commanding even among his own fierce warriors. "I am Ragnar Lothbrok of Kattegat. We come seeking trade and adventure in the lands of the East." Sviatoslav's eyes narrowed. "Trade? Your ships are filled with warriors, not merchants. Speak truly, Northman, or this river will run red with your blood." For a tense moment, it seemed battle was inevitable. Then Ragnar did something unexpected. He laughed. The sound echoed across the water, startling both Slavs and Vikings alike. "You have the heart of a Viking, Sviatoslav," Ragnar exclaimed. "Come, let us talk as men. I swear by my gods that no harm will come to you or yours while we parley." Curiosity overcame caution, and soon the two groups were mingling on the island, sharing food and drink as they attempted to bridge the gap between their cultures. As the day wore on, Ragnar and Sviatoslav found themselves deep in conversation, each fascinated by the other's tales of distant lands and strange customs. "Your people are fierce warriors," Sviatoslav admitted, "but these lands are vast and filled with dangers you cannot imagine. What do you truly seek here?" Ragnar's eyes gleamed with ambition. "A new world, my friend. One where Viking and Slav might forge an empire to rival any in history." As night fell and the mead flowed freely, it seemed that a tenuous alliance might be forming between the two groups. But in the shadows, discontent was brewing. Rollo paced at the edge of the camp, his mind churning with resentment. Always he had stood in his brother's shadow, watching as Ragnar reaped the glory that should have been his. Now, in this strange land, he saw an opportunity. Under the cover of darkness, Rollo slipped away from the camp, making his way to where the Slavs had gathered. "Sviatoslav," Rollo hissed, approaching the Slavic leader. "I must speak with you alone. My brother plans to betray you come dawn." Sviatoslav's hand went to his sword. "Speak quickly, Northman. Why should I trust the words of a traitor?" Rollo's eyes glittered in the moonlight. "Because I offer you something more valuable than trust: power. Help me overthrow Ragnar, and I will ensure that your people prosper under Viking protection." For a moment, Sviatoslav seemed to consider the offer. Then, faster than Rollo could react, the Slav's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. "I may not trust your brother fully," Sviatoslav growled, "but I trust a serpent like you even less. Guards, seize him." Rollo, dazed but defiant, managed to break free and flee back towards the Viking camp. But the damage was done. As dawn broke, both sides awoke to find themselves on the brink of war. Chaos erupted as Vikings and Slavs clashed on the narrow island. Steel rang against steel, war cries mingling with the screams of the dying. Ragnar fought like a man possessed, his axe rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. "Rollo!" he roared, searching for his treacherous brother amidst the melee. "Face me, you coward!" But Rollo was nowhere to be found, having slipped away in the confusion of battle. As the fighting reached its peak, a new sound cut through the din, the war horns of an approaching force. From the river emerged a fleet of ships, their design a curious blend of Norse and Slavic influences. At their head stood a man whose very presence seemed to calm the storm of battle. "Enough!" the newcomer bellowed, his voice carrying an unmistakable air of authority. "In the name of Rurik, ruler of Novgorod, I command you to lay down your arms." The fighting ground to a halt as both sides turned to face this unexpected arrival. Ragnar, bloodied but unbowed, stepped forward. "And who is this Rurik who dares command Ragnar Lothbrok?" he challenged. The man on the lead ship smiled, a glint of recognition in his eyes. "A fellow Norseman, though one who has found his destiny in these eastern lands. Come, Ragnar Lothbrok. Let us speak as kinsmen and put an end to this senseless bloodshed." As the two leaders met on neutral ground, the tension in the air was palpable. Rurik, it transpired, was a Viking who had come east years before, carving out a kingdom for himself among the Slavic tribes. "You see, Ragnar," Rurik explained, gesturing to the diverse group of warriors that surrounded him, "there is room enough in these lands for both Norse and Slav. Why fight amongst ourselves when together we could build an empire to rival Charlemagne's?" Ragnar's mind raced with the possibilities. Here was a man who understood his vision, who had already begun to make it a reality. "And what of Sviatoslav and his people?" Ragnar asked, eyeing the Slavic leader who stood nearby, still wary. Rurik smiled. "They will be our partners in this great endeavor. The Slavs know these lands, and we bring the strength and seafaring skills of the Norse. Together we will be unstoppable." As the day wore on, a new alliance began to take shape. Ragnar and Rurik spoke long into the night, sharing their dreams of conquest and empire. Sviatoslav, seeing the wisdom in unity, agreed to join their cause. But even as plans were made and oaths sworn, Ragnar couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Rollo was still out there, no doubt plotting his next move. And the lands ahead remained largely unknown, filled with challenges they had yet to face. As he gazed out over the river that had brought them this far, Ragnar whispered a prayer to Odin. "Guide us, All-Father, through the trials to come, for I fear this is only the beginning of our greatest adventure yet." Little did Ragnar know just how prophetic those words would prove to be, as the saga of the Vikings in the east was only just beginning to unfold. The wooden palisades of Novgorod rose like a defiant fist against the vast wilderness that surrounded it. Rurik, the Norse warrior who had carved out a kingdom in this foreign land, stood atop the walls, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. Below him, the bustling settlement thrummed with life, a curious blend of Norse vigor and Slavic tradition. "My lord," a voice called from behind him. Rurik turned to see Oleg, his trusted advisor, approaching with a group of local tribal leaders. "The Krivichi have agreed to our terms," Oleg reported, a hint of triumph in his voice. "Their chief, Vadim, wishes to swear fealty to you personally." Rurik nodded, his face impassive despite the satisfaction he felt, another piece falling into place. He descended from the wall to meet the tribal delegation, his bearing every inch that of a king. Vadim, a burly man with a graying beard, stepped forward and knelt before Rurik. "Great Prince," he said in halting Norse, "the Krivichi pledge our swords and our lives to your cause. May your rule bring prosperity to all our peoples." Rurik placed a hand on Vadim's shoulder, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Rise, friend. Your people are now under my protection. Together, we shall build a realm that will be the envy of the world." As the ceremony concluded and the tribal leaders dispersed, Oleg approached Rurik once more. "Word has come from the south," he murmured. "Ragnar Lothbrok has set sail for his homeland." A thoughtful expression crossed Rurik's face. "And so the board is set," he mused. "Keep me informed of any news from Kattegat. Ragnar's influence among the Norse will be crucial in the days to come." Thousands of miles to the west, the fjords of Kattegat welcomed home their prodigal son. Ragnar Lothbrok stood at the prow of his ship, his eyes drinking in the familiar sights of home. But behind that gaze, his mind whirled with visions of the east, of vast rivers, golden cities, and untold opportunities. As he stepped onto the dock, a crowd gathered to welcome their returned hero. At the forefront stood Lagertha, her beauty undimmed by the years, and beside her, a young man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Ragnar himself. "Father!" Bjorn called out, his voice deeper than Ragnar remembered. The boy he had left behind had become a man in his absence. Ragnar embraced his son, marveling at the strength he felt in Bjorn's frame. "You've grown, my boy," he said with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "I've missed so much." Lagertha approached, her eyes a storm of emotions. "Welcome home, husband," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I trust your adventures were fruitful?" Ragnar grinned, sweeping her into his arms. "Oh, my love," he whispered. "You cannot imagine the wonders I've seen. The world is so much larger than we ever dreamed." As the initial excitement of the homecoming faded, Ragnar gathered his family and closest advisors in the great hall. There, by the flickering light of the hearth, he regaled them with tales of his journey, of treacherous rivers, fierce battles, and the enigmatic Rurik who ruled in the east. Bjorn listened with rapt attention, his heart racing at the thought of such adventures. As the night wore on and the mead flowed freely, the young man slipped away from the festivities, his mind made up. In the privacy of his quarters, Bjorn began to plan. Maps were studied, provisions calculated, loyal friends sounded out in whispered conversations. He would follow in his father's footsteps, but blaze his own trail. The east called to him, a siren song of glory and destiny. Weeks passed, and word of Rurik's growing power in the Russlands began to spread throughout the Norse world. In taverns and mead halls from Norway to Denmark, warriors spoke in hushed tones of the opportunities that awaited in the east. In Kattegat, Ragnar found himself besieged by ambitious young men, all clamoring for a chance to join the next expedition. But as he considered his options, trouble began to brew closer to home. Jarl Borg, a powerful chieftain from a neighboring territory, arrived in Kattegat with a sizable retinue. His ostensible purpose was to pay respects to Ragnar and hear of his eastern adventures. But there was a predatory gleam in Borg's eye that set Ragnar on edge. "The east sounds like a land of great promise, Ragnar," Borg said as they sat in the great hall. "Perhaps it's time for new blood to lead our people to these riches. You've had your glory after all." Ragnar's eyes narrowed, sensing the challenge in Borg's words. "Are you offering to lead such an expedition, Jarl Borg?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Borg smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "I'm merely suggesting that perhaps your time has passed. The people whisper that you've grown soft, content to rest on your laurels while others seek glory." The hall fell silent, all eyes on the two leaders. Ragnar rose slowly, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. "Is that what the people whisper, Borg? Or is it what you wish they would say?" Before Borg could respond, Ragnar's voice rose, addressing the entire hall. "I have seen wonders beyond imagining, my friends. I have fought beside Rus princes and Slavic warriors, and I tell you now, the future of our people lies in the east." His eyes blazed with an inner fire as he continued. "But that future will be claimed by the strong, the bold, the true Vikings among us, not by jackals who snap at the heels of giants." With a speed that belied his years, Ragnar drew his sword and leveled it at Borg's throat. "You question my strength, Jarl Borg. Then test it, here and now, before gods and men." The challenge hung in the air, heavy as a storm cloud. Borg's hand twitched towards his own weapon, but the fire in Ragnar's eyes gave him pause. After a moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, Borg lowered his gaze. "Forgive me, Lord Ragnar," he said, his voice thick with suppressed rage. "I spoke out of turn. Your strength is undeniable." Ragnar held his position for a moment longer, then slowly lowered his blade. "See that you remember it," he growled. "Now leave my hall. You are no longer welcome in Kattegat." As Borg and his men departed, A cheer went up from the assembled Vikings. Ragnar had reasserted his dominance, but he knew the challenge to his rule was far from over. Later that night, as Ragnar stood alone on the cliffs overlooking the sea, Lagertha joined him. "You handled Borg well," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "But he won't be the last to challenge you." Ragnar nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "No, he won't. The whispers will grow louder. The young and ambitious will always seek to topple the old guard." He turned to his wife, a familiar glint of adventure in his eye. "Which is why we must act soon. The East is the key to our future, Lagertha. Rurik has shown us the way. We must gather our strength, unite our people, and strike out for those distant shores." Lagertha studied her husband's face, seeing the passion that burned within him. "And what of our son?" she asked softly. "Bjorn is a man now, with his own dreams of glory." Ragnar's expression softened. "Bjorn will have his chance. But first he must learn. The East is no place for rash youth. When we go as a family, as a people united in purpose." As they stood together, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, neither Ragnar nor Lagertha could have foreseen the trials that lay ahead. The seeds of a new empire had been planted, both in the distant Ruslands and in the hearts of the Norse people. But as any farmer knows, seeds must weather many storms before they can bear fruit. In the coming days, Ragnar would face more challenges to his rule. Bjorn would struggle against the bonds of youth and across the vast expanse of land and sea. Rurik would continue to build his power base, drawing more and more Norsemen to his cause. The saga of the Vikings in the East was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The skies over Kattegat were leaden, matching the mood that had descended upon the Viking stronghold. A lone ship had limped into the harbor, its crew bearing news that would shake the Norse world to its core. Bjorn Ironside stood on the docks, his face a mask of disbelief as he listened to the sailor's tale. "It cannot be," Bjorn muttered, his fists clenching at his sides. "My father, Ragnar Lothbrok, dead?" The sailor, his face haggard from the long journey, nodded solemnly. "Aye, my lord, thrown into a pit of snakes by King Aela of Northumbria. Your father's last words, they say, were a call for vengeance." Bjorn's brothers gathered around him, each face a study in shock and rage. Ubi, the eldest after Bjorn, spoke first. "How do we know this is true? Ragnar Lothbrok is no ordinary man. He has cheated death before." Ivar the Boneless, dragging himself forward on his crippled legs, sneered. "Whether true or not, brothers, we cannot let this insult stand. The English must pay in blood." As word spread through Kattegat, a pall of grief mixed with a thirst for vengeance settled over the town. Vikings from all walks of life began to gather, drawn by the magnetic pull of imminent war. In the great hall, Bjorn addressed the assembled warriors, his voice resonating with barely contained fury. "My father, Ragnar Lothbrok, is dead, murdered by the cowardly English king who feared him too much to face him in honorable combat. I ask you now, will we let this crime go unpunished?" A roar went up from the crowd, weapons brandished in the air. Bjorn continued, his eyes blazing. "Then hear me, people of the North. I call for the greatest army our lands have ever seen. Every ship, every warrior, every weapon we can muster. We will descend upon England like the wrath of the gods themselves." As the preparations began in earnest, ships from all corners of the Norse world began to arrive. Jarls and chieftains pledged their support, eager to be part of what promised to be the stuff of legend. Lagertha, her face etched with grief but her spirit unbroken, approached her son. "Bjorn," she said softly, "your father would be proud of you. But remember, vengeance is a double-edged sword. Do not let it consume you." Bjorn nodded, embracing his mother. "I know, mother. But this is about more than vengeance. This is about showing the world the true might of the Vikings. We will carve out a kingdom in England that will last 1,000 years." As the days turned to weeks, the harbor of Kattegat filled with ships beyond counting. Warriors from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their purpose. The great heathen army was taking shape. On the eve of their departure, Ivar approached Bjorn. Despite his physical limitations, there was a dangerous intelligence in his eyes that commanded respect. "Brother," Ivar said, his voice low and intense, "I have been studying the maps of England, learning their defenses. I believe I know how we can strike them where they least expect it." Bjorn raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on, Ivar. What do you propose?" As Ivar laid out his strategy, Bjorn found himself nodding in approval. His younger brother might be unable to stand, but his mind was a weapon sharper than any sword. Finally, the day of departure arrived. The fjord was filled with ships as far as the eye could see. Their dragon-headed prows pointed towards the open sea. Bjorn stood at the bow of the lead ship, his father's sword in hand. "For Ragnar," he roared, his voice carrying across the water. "For glory. For Valhalla." The journey across the North Sea was fraught with danger, but the gods seemed to favor the Viking fleet. They landed on the shores of East Anglia with minimal losses, catching the English completely off guard. The great heathen army swept across the land like a tidal wave, leaving destruction in its wake. Villages burned, monasteries were plundered, and the Anglo-Saxon forces found themselves outmatched at every turn. King Aelle of Northumbria, upon hearing of the Viking invasion, gathered his forces to meet the threat. But Ivar's cunning strategy had divided the English forces, leaving them vulnerable. In a decisive battle outside York, Ivar's tactical genius shone through. From his war chariot, he directed the Viking forces with uncanny precision. The English, expecting a straightforward clash, found themselves outflanked and surrounded. As the battle reached its peak, Ivar turned to Bjorn, a wild grin on his face. "Now, brother, release the berserkers." Bjorn gave the signal, and a wave of Viking warriors, driven into a battle frenzy by a combination of ritual and herbs, crashed into the English lines. The slaughter that followed would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations to come. In the aftermath of the battle, King Aelle was captured. Bjorn and his brothers stood over the defeated monarch, their eyes cold with hate. "You killed our father," Bjorn growled, his sword at Aelle's throat. "Now you will suffer as he suffered." What followed was a grim reenactment of Ragnar's reported death. Aelle was thrown into a pit of vipers, his screams echoing across the battlefield. As the English king's life ebbed away, Bjorn felt a hollow victory. Vengeance had been achieved, but at what cost? As the Vikings consolidated their hold on Northumbria, preparing to push further into England, an unexpected visitor arrived at their camp. A hooded figure, escorted by wary guards, was brought before Bjorn and his brothers. "Who are you?" Bjorn demanded, his hand on his sword hilt. "Speak quickly, stranger." The figure threw back his hood, revealing a face that, though weathered and scarred, was unmistakable. Gasps of shock rippled through the assembled warriors. "Father?" Ubi whispered, his voice trembling. Ragnar Lothbrok, very much alive, stood before his sons. His eyes, once so full of fire, now held a weary wisdom. "My sons," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I see you received my message." Confusion and joy warred on the faces of the brothers. Bjorn stepped forward, torn between embracing his father and striking him. "How is this possible? We were told you were dead, thrown into a pit of snakes by Aelle." Ragnar nodded, a grim smile on his face. "And so I was. But the gods had other plans for me. I survived, barely, and have been biding my time, waiting for the right moment to reveal myself." Ivar, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, spoke up. "And why reveal yourself now, father? Why not earlier, before we launched this invasion?" Ragnar's gaze swept over his sons, pride mingling with something darker. "Because, my clever Ivar, I needed to see what you would do, how you would lead, how you would avenge me, and you have not disappointed." A heavy silence fell over the camp as the implications of Ragnar's words sank in. The great heathen army had been set in motion by a lie, albeit one with a kernel of truth. The invasion of England, the death of Ella, the destruction wrought across the land, all part of Ragnar's grand design. Bjorn, his mind reeling, faced his father. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have started something that cannot be easily stopped. The English will not rest until they have driven us from their shores." Ragnar's eyes gleamed with the old fire, a vision of empire dancing behind them. "Now, my sons, we build. We carve out our kingdom, not just in England but across the sea to the east as well. The world is changing, and we must change with it. The age of Viking raids is ending. The age of Viking kingdoms is just beginning." As night fell over the Viking camp, bonfires were lit in celebration of Ragnar's return. But amidst the joy, questions lingered. What other secrets did Ragnar hold? How would this revelation affect the fragile alliances within the great heathen army? And what challenges lay ahead as they sought to transform their conquests into a lasting realm? The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons had taken an unexpected turn, but one thing was certain: the story was far from over. The greatest chapters were yet to be written, in blood and glory across the lands of England and beyond. The wooden walls of Novgorod rose higher with each passing season, a testament to Rurik's growing power in the east. The Norse warrior-turned-ruler stood atop the freshly completed watchtower, surveying the bustling settlement below. Slavic tribesmen mingled with Norse traders, their languages blending in a cacophony of commerce and culture. Oleg, Rurik's trusted advisor, approached with a group of tribal leaders in tow. "My prince," he said, bowing slightly, "the chieftains of the Dregovici have arrived to swear fealty." Rurik nodded, his keen eyes appraising the newcomers. "Welcome, friends," he said in fluent Slavic. "Your people will find protection and prosperity under my rule." The lead chieftain, a grizzled man named Vseslav, stepped forward. "We have heard of your strength, Prince Rurik, but we have also heard you are not of our blood. How can we trust a foreigner to rule justly over us?" A tense silence fell over the gathering. Rurik's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, but he checked the motion. Instead, he smiled, spreading his arms wide. "Look around you, Vseslav," Rurik said. "See how Norse and Slav work side by side. I may not share your blood, but I share your vision of a strong, united land. Under my rule, your people will flourish as never before." Vseslav considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Prince Rurik. The Dregovici pledge our loyalty. May your reign be long and prosperous." As the ceremony concluded, Oleg approached Rurik privately. "Well handled, my prince. But there are whispers of a new threat from the east. Nomads from the steppes, more numerous and fierce than any we have faced before." Rurik's brow furrowed. "We must prepare. Send word to our allies among the Slavs and the Norse. We may soon face a storm that will test the foundations of all we have built." Half a world away, the Mediterranean sun beat down on the deck of a Viking longship. Bjorn Ironside stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the towers of a great city were just becoming visible. "Constantinople," he breathed, awe evident in his voice. "The greatest city in the world." Halfdan, Bjorn's loyal friend and fellow warrior, joined him at the railing. "It's said the Emperor's palace is roofed with pure gold," Halfdan remarked. "Do you think it's true?" Bjorn grinned, the thrill of adventure coursing through him. "We'll soon find out, my friend. But remember, we come as traders and explorers, not raiders. At least, not yet." As their small fleet approached the massive sea walls of Constantinople, they were met by Byzantine warships. A tense negotiation ensued, with Bjorn using every ounce of diplomacy he had learned from his father. Finally, they were granted limited access to the city. As Bjorn walked the streets of Constantinople, he was overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells. Spices from India, silks from China, architecture unlike anything he had ever seen. In the great marketplace, Bjorn found himself face to face with a Saracen merchant. The man, sensing Bjorn's interest in his wares, spoke in broken Greek. "You come from far, yes? I have something special for men of the north." The merchant produced a finely crafted astrolabe, its brass surface gleaming in the sunlight. Bjorn's eyes widened as the merchant demonstrated its use. "With this," the merchant explained, "you can navigate by the stars themselves. No coastline needed." Bjorn's mind raced with the possibilities. Such a device could revolutionize Viking exploration. As he haggled with the merchant, Bjorn couldn't help but feel that this expedition would change the course of Norse history. Back in England, Ivar the Boneless sat upon a throne in the great hall of York, his crippled legs hidden beneath a cloak of fine wool. Before him knelt a Saxon ealdorman trembling with fear. "Please, Lord Ivar," the man pleaded. "We cannot pay any more in tribute. Our people starve." Ivar's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your people starve because they resist. Submit fully to Viking rule and you will prosper." From the shadows, Ubi stepped forward. "Brother," he said softly, "perhaps we should show more mercy. We cannot rule a land of corpses." Ivar's head snapped towards his brother, anger flashing in his eyes. "Mercy? It was not mercy that won us this land, Ubi. It was strength. Fear. The Saxons must learn their place." The tension between the brothers had been growing for months. Ivar's brutal tactics had secured their hold on much of England, but Ubi and Vitzerk feared he was going too far. Later, in private council, the brothers' disagreement erupted into open conflict. "You're mad with power, Ivar," Vitzerk shouted. "This is not what Father would have wanted," Ivar sneered, his hand tightening on the arm of his chair. "Father is not here. I am. And I say we crush the Saxons until they beg for the privilege of serving us." Ubbi stepped between his brothers, his voice calm but firm. "Enough. We must find a balance, or we risk losing everything we've gained. The Saxons outnumber us. We need their cooperation, not just their fear." Ivar's eyes blazed with inner fire. "You sound like a Christian, brother. Weak, soft. Perhaps you've forgotten what it means to be a Viking." The rift between the sons of Ragnar was widening, threatening to tear apart the fragile Viking kingdom they had fought so hard to establish. As his sons grappled with the challenges of rule, Ragnar Lothbrok found himself increasingly withdrawn. The fire that had driven him for so long seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a weariness that settled deep in his bones. One night, as he sat alone by the fire in his private chambers, Lagertha entered. Though they had long since parted ways as husband and wife, a deep bond still connected them. "What troubles you, Ragnar?" Lagertha asked, sitting beside him. "Your sons have conquered England. Bjorn explores the known world, and our people prosper. Is this not what you always wanted?" Ragnar was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "I wanted glory for our people, yes," he said finally. "But at what cost? My sons fight amongst themselves. The old ways are changing, and I feel lost, Lagertha." Lagertha placed a hand on his arm, her touch as familiar as it was comforting. "The world changes, Ragnar. We must change with it or be left behind. Your legacy is not just in conquests, but in the future you've opened for our people." Ragnar nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. As Lagertha left, he couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest challenges for the Vikings were yet to come. Far to the east, on the windswept steppes beyond Rurik's realm, a vast horde was gathering. Thousands of mounted warriors led by a charismatic Khan prepared for a westward push that would shake the foundations of Europe. A scout rode hard for Novgorod, his horse lathered with sweat. He burst into Rurik's hall, gasping for breath. "My prince," he panted. "They come. The Pechenegs, more numerous than the stars in the sky, more fierce than wolves in winter." Rurik's face hardened as he processed the news. He turned to his advisors, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Send word to all our allies. Call in every favor, every oath of loyalty. We stand at the crossroads of history, my friends. What we do in the coming days will determine the fate of our people for generations to come. As messengers rode out in all directions, carrying word of the coming storm, Rurik couldn't help but wonder if the empire he had worked so hard to build was about to face its greatest test. The Northman who had united the Slavs was about to face a threat that could unravel everything he had accomplished. The stage was set for a clash that would reshape the map of Eastern Europe and test the mettle of Viking, Slav, and nomad alike. As the sun rose over the vast forests of the east, a fleet of sleek longships glided silently down the Dnieper River. At the helm of the lead vessel stood Oleg, successor to the great Rurik, his keen eyes fixed on the horizon where the fabled city of Kiev awaited. "Do you see it, my prince?" whispered Igor, Rurik's young heir, barely containing his excitement. Oleg nodded, a wolfish grin spreading across his weathered face. "Aye, lad, the jewel of the Slavs, and soon it will be ours." As they approached the city, Oleg raised his hand, signaling the fleet to slow. The element of surprise was crucial to their plan. Years of careful preparation, gathering intelligence from traders and spies, had led to this moment. Under the cover of early morning mist, Oleg's warriors slipped ashore, moving with the silent efficiency that had made the Rus feared throughout the region. The city's defenses, formidable against a frontal assault, were useless against this stealthy infiltration. By the time the sun had fully risen, Oleg stood in the Great Hall of Kiev, facing the startled local rulers. "Greetings, friends," Oleg said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. "I am Oleg, Prince of Novgorod and heir to Rurik's legacy. I come not to destroy, but to unite. Join us, and together we shall build an empire that will be the envy of the world." The Kievan leaders exchanged nervous glances, acutely aware of the Rus warriors surrounding them. Finally, the eldest among them stepped forward. "Prince Oleg," he said, bowing slightly, "your reputation precedes you. We have heard tales of Rurik's wisdom and strength. If you truly come in peace, perhaps there is much we can learn from each other." Oleg smiled, clasping the man's arm in a warrior's grip. "Wise words, my friend. Let this day mark the beginning of a new era for all our peoples." As word of Kiev's bloodless conquest spread, other Slavic tribes and settlements quickly pledged their loyalty to Oleg. The foundation of what would become Kievan Rus was laid. Months passed, and Oleg's grip on his new territories strengthened. But the ambitious prince was not content. His gaze turned south, towards the glittering prize of Constantinople. "The Byzantine Empire is weak," Oleg declared to his advisors. "Their emperor is a child, their military stretched thin. The time to strike is now." Igor, eager to prove himself, leaned forward. "A raid on Constantinople would bring us untold riches, uncle. But their walls are legendary. How can we hope to breach them?" Oleg's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Who said anything about breaching them, lad? We'll use their own arrogance against them." The plan Oleg unveiled was audacious. A small force would approach Constantinople openly, posing as traitors. Meanwhile, the bulk of their army would be hidden in boats, disguised as harmless cargo. As dawn broke over the Bosphorus, the Byzantine guards watched with mild interest as a modest fleet of Rus ships approached. The lead vessel flew a flag of truce, and a delegation was sent to meet with the emperor's representatives. Oleg, dressed as a simple merchant, bowed low before the Byzantine officials. "Greetings, noble sirs. We come seeking to trade our furs and amber for your fine silks and spices." The officials, accustomed to dealing with barbarian traders, barely concealed their disdain. "Very well," one said dismissively. "You may dock your ships and conduct your business, but be warned, any trouble and you'll face the full might of the empire." Oleg nodded humbly, fighting to keep the grin from his face. As night fell and the city settled into slumber, the true nature of the Rus cargo was revealed. Warriors poured from hidden compartments, scaling the walls and opening the gates from within. By morning, Constantinople was in chaos. Oleg's forces, vastly outnumbered but striking with precision, had targeted key locations throughout the city. The imperial treasury was emptied, priceless artifacts were seized, and the emperor himself was cornered in his palace. Standing before the trembling young ruler, Oleg felt a moment of pity. "Fear not, little emperor," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We have not come to destroy your empire, only to remind you of our strength. Agree to our terms and we shall leave your city intact." The terms Oleg proposed were steep: an annual tribute, exclusive trading rights, and recognition of Rus' sovereignty over the lands they controlled. But faced with the alternative, the Byzantine emperor had little choice but to agree. As the Rus fleet sailed away from Constantinople, their ships heavy with gold and their hearts swelling with pride, Igor turned to his uncle. "This is a day that will be remembered in sagas for generations to come," he said, awe evident in his voice. Oleg nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Aye, lad. But remember, with great victory comes great responsibility. We must use these riches wisely to build and strengthen our realm." Months later, as the spoils of their raid were being distributed in Kiev, word reached them of another momentous arrival. Bjorn Ironside, son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, had returned from his Mediterranean adventures. Oleg welcomed the Norse prince with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a hero of his stature. As they sat in the great hall, sharing mead and tales of their exploits, Oleg could see that Bjorn had been profoundly changed by his journeys. "The world is so much larger than we ever imagined, Oleg," Bjorn said, his eyes distant with memory. "I've seen wonders that defy description, met people with customs stranger than any saga. It's changed how I see everything." Oleg leaned forward, intrigued. "And how do you see us, Bjorn? We who are building a new realm here in the East?" Bjorn was silent for a moment, considering. "I see a future," he said finally. "A future where Norse and Slav, trader and warrior all work together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. But it won't be easy. The old ways die hard, and there are always those who resist change." Oleg nodded thoughtfully. "Wise words, my friend. Perhaps that is why the gods have brought you here at this moment. We stand at a crossroads, and your experiences could help guide us forward." In the days that followed, Oleg and Bjorn spent long hours in discussion, sharing ideas and strategies. The treaty with Byzantium was refined, incorporating elements of the trade agreements Bjorn had observed in the Mediterranean. As winter approached, Oleg made a momentous decision. Standing before a gathering of Rus nobles, Slavic chieftains, and Norse warriors, he raised his voice to be heard by all. "Friends, allies, fellow builders of our great realm, today I declare that Kiev shall be our new capital. From this city on the Dnieper, we shall forge a new empire, one that bridges east and west, north and south. Let all the world know that the Rus have come of age." The cheers that erupted shook the very foundations of the city. As bonfires were lit and celebrations began, Oleg stood with Bjorn and Igor, watching the jubilant crowds. "This is only the beginning," Oleg said softly. "The birth of Kievan Rus. May it grow strong and endure for 1,000 years." As the stars wheeled overhead and the future stretched out before them, full of promise and peril, the three men raised their cups in a silent toast. The saga of the Rus was entering a new chapter, one that would reshape the very fabric of Eastern Europe and beyond. The autumn winds whistled through the wooden palisades of Kiev as Prince Igor, son of Rurik and heir to the Rus throne, stood atop the city walls. His eyes narrowed as he watched a small group of travelers approach the gate. Their simple robes and wooden crosses marked them as something new and potentially dangerous: Christian missionaries. "My prince," Sviatoslav, Igor's young son and heir, tugged at his father's cloak. "Who are these strangers?" Igor's face was grim as he replied, "They are men of the Christian God, come to spread their faith among our people." As the missionaries were escorted into the great hall, tension filled the air. The leader of the group, a gaunt man named Father Adalbert, bowed before Igor. "Greetings, noble prince," Adalbert said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent. "We come in peace, bringing the word of the one true God." Igor's hand instinctively tightened on the hilt of his sword. "We have our own gods, priest, gods who have served us well for generations. Why should we abandon them for yours?" Adalbert smiled gently. "Because our God offers salvation, Prince Igor, eternal life and peace beyond this mortal realm." A murmur ran through the assembled Rus nobles. Some looked intrigued, others outraged. Igor raised a hand for silence. "You may stay," he declared, "and share your teachings with those who wish to hear them. But know this, any attempt to force your faith upon my people will be met with swift retribution." As the missionaries settled into their quarters, word of their arrival spread rapidly through Kiev and beyond. The clash between the old ways and the new had begun. Thousands of miles to the west, in the Viking stronghold of York, Ivar the Boneless sat brooding in his chambers. A similar group of Christian priests had arrived in his territory, and their words had stirred something unexpected within him. "Brother," Vitzerk said, entering the room. "The men grow restless. They say you've been spending too much time with these Christian dogs." Ivar's eyes flashed with anger, but there was uncertainty behind them. "And what if I have? Their God. He speaks of forgiveness, of a strength beyond the physical. Sometimes I wonder." Vitzerk stepped back, shock evident on his face. "You can't be serious, Ivar. You, of all people, considering abandoning the gods of our fathers?" Ivar slammed his fist on the table. "I don't know what I'm considering," he roared. "All my life I've fought against my broken body, proving my worth through cunning and cruelty. But what if there's another way?" As the brothers argued, neither noticed the figure listening from the shadows. Ubi, the eldest of Ragnar's surviving sons, slipped away, his mind racing. If Ivar truly converted to Christianity, it could tear their fragile kingdom apart. Far to the north, on the windswept coast of Norway, Bjorn Ironside prepared for his greatest adventure yet. The tales he had heard in Constantinople of a land far to the west had ignited a fire in his soul. "Vinland," he murmured, tracing the route on a crude map. "A new world, ripe for exploration." Torvi, his wife, watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. "It's a perilous journey, Bjorn. Many say this Vinland is nothing but a myth." Bjorn turned to her, his eyes alight with the thrill of adventure. "All great discoveries begin as myths, my love. Think of what this could mean for our people. New lands, new resources, a fresh start away from the conflicts of the old world." As Bjorn's fleet prepared to set sail, word of his expedition spread. Many young warriors, eager for glory and riches, flocked to join him. But not everyone was supportive. The local Godi, or pagan priest, approached Bjorn on the eve of his departure. "The gods have not blessed this voyage, Ironside," the old man warned. "The signs speak of great danger." Bjorn merely laughed. "The greatest danger is in never daring, old friend. If the gods wish to stop me, let them try." As the longship sailed into the unknown, those left behind could only wonder what fate awaited the bold explorers. Back in Kiev, Prince Igor found himself walking a precarious line. The Christian missionaries had gained a following among some of the Slavic population, while many of the Norse warriors clung fiercely to their pagan traditions. "We cannot allow these foreign priests to undermine our way of life," growled Rurik, a grizzled Viking captain. "Our gods demand blood and sacrifice. How can we appease them if half our people are kneeling to this crucified weakling?" Igor raised a hand for calm. "We must find a balance, Rurik. The Rus is built on the strength of both Norse and Slav. If we're to survive, we must learn to coexist." But finding that balance proved increasingly difficult. Tensions rose as pagan festivals clashed with Christian holy days. Brawls broke out in the streets of Kiev, and whispers of rebellion reached Igor's ears. The prince found himself turning more and more to his son, Sviatoslav, for counsel. The boy, though young, showed a wisdom beyond his years. "Father," Sviatoslav said one evening as they walked the castle ramparts, "perhaps we should not see this as Norse versus Slav or pagan versus Christian. Perhaps this is an opportunity to create something new, a faith and culture uniquely our own." Igor looked at his son with newfound respect. "You may be right, my boy. But how do we achieve such a thing?" Before Sviatoslav could answer, a commotion from the city below caught their attention. A crowd had gathered in the main square, pointing and shouting at the sky. As Igor and Sviatoslav rushed to see what was happening, they gasped in awe. The northern lights, rarely seen this far south, danced across the heavens in a spectacular display. The pagan priests declared it a sign from the gods, while the Christian missionaries spoke of divine wonders. But to many of the common people, it was simply a beautiful mystery, transcending any single faith or tradition. In that moment, as the sky blazed with unearthly light, a seed of an idea took root in Igor's mind. Perhaps this was the way forward, embracing the mystery and wonder of the world, beyond the constraints of any one belief system. As the northern lights faded from Kiev's sky, their ethereal glow seemed to spread across the Rus lands, manifesting in a series of inexplicable events that challenged the beliefs of pagans and Christians alike. In a small village near Novgorod, a well that had run dry for generations suddenly burst forth with water clear as crystal. The Christian priests declared it a miracle, while the pagan shamans insisted it was the work of ancient spirits. Along the banks of the Volga, fishermen reported seeing ghostly longships sailing against the current, crewed by warriors with gleaming axes and eyes of flame. Old women whispered that the gods themselves were walking the earth once more, and in the deep forests of the north, hunters spoke in hushed tones of a great white stag, larger than any seen before, with antlers that seemed to glow with an inner light. Those who followed it found themselves led to hidden groves of incredible beauty, or to rich deposits of silver and amber. These tales spread like wildfire, growing with each retelling. For many, they were simply exciting stories to share over mead in smoky halls. But for others, they represented a profound challenge to everything they believed. Father Adalbert found his faith tested as he traveled the Rus lands, witnessing events he could not explain. "Lord," he prayed one night, his voice trembling, "give me the wisdom to understand your will in this strange land." Meanwhile, the pagan priests and shamans debated fiercely among themselves, trying to interpret the meaning behind these omens and portents. In Kiev, Prince Igor called a great council, gathering representatives from all the diverse peoples and faiths of his realm. As they assembled in the great hall, the tension was palpable. "My friends," Igor began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "we stand at a crossroads. Our world is changing and we must change with it or be left behind." He gestured to the Christians and pagans, the Norsemen and Slavs, the traders and warriors. "Each of you brings strength to our realm. Each of you carries wisdom passed down through generations. But none of us has all the answers." A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others scowling in disagreement. Igor continued, his voice growing stronger. "The wonders we have witnessed, the challenges we face, they are too great for any one tradition to fully comprehend. So I propose this. Let us create something new, a way of thinking, of believing, that draws from all our strengths while transcending our differences." The hall erupted in a cacophony of voices, some cheering, others protesting. But as the debate raged on, a strange sense of possibility filled the air. The Rus stood on the brink of a new era, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and their place in the world. As the council continued long into the night, none could have guessed the far-reaching consequences of their decisions. The seeds of a unique Rus identity were being sown, one that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. And far to the west, as Bjorn Ironside's ships battled fierce Atlantic storms in search of Vinland, and Ivar the Boneless wrestled with his crisis of faith in the halls of York, the winds of change howled across the known world. The age of Vikings was transforming into something new and unpredictable. a crucible in which the future of nations would be forged. The ancient seer's eyes rolled back in her head, her voice taking on an otherworldly timbre as she spoke to the assembled sons of Ragnar. "The blood of the Lothbrok will shape the fate of nations," she intoned. "One son shall embrace the cross, another will discover a new world, and a third will face the fury of the steppes. But beware, for the twilight of the gods approaches, and with it, a battle that will shake the very foundations of the earth." As the prophecy echoed through the halls of power from York to Kiev, its words began to take on a life of their own, shaping the actions of those who heard them in ways both subtle and profound. In the great hall of York, Ivar the Boneless sat upon his throne, his mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts and beliefs. The Christian priests had continued their work, and their words had taken root in his troubled soul. "Brother," Vitzerk said, approaching cautiously, "the men grow restless. They say you've forsaken the old gods entirely." Ivar's eyes, once filled with fire and rage, now held a strange calm. "Perhaps I have, Vitzerk. I've seen too much, questioned too deeply. The old ways, they no longer speak to me as they once did." Vitzerk's face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "You would abandon everything our father fought for? Everything we've built?" Ivar leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "No, brother. I would transform it. The world is changing. If we don't change with it, we'll be left behind." As the brothers argued, neither noticed the figure listening from the shadows. Ubi, the eldest of Ragnar's surviving sons, slipped away, his mind racing. If Ivar truly converted to Christianity, it could tear their fragile kingdom apart, or forge it into something entirely new. Days later, Ivar made his decision public. Standing before a gathered crowd of Vikings and Saxons alike, he held aloft a wooden cross. "My people," he called out, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly. "I have walked in darkness for too long. Today, I embrace the light of Christ, and I call upon all of you to join me in building a new kingdom, one that bridges the old world and the new." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of cheers and outraged cries. As Ivar was baptized in the nearby river, watched by a mix of awestruck converts and seething traditionalists, the seeds of a New England were sown. Far to the east, on the windswept steppes beyond the Russ lands, a vast horde was gathering. Thousands upon thousands of mounted warriors, their eyes fixed on the rich lands to the west. In Kiev, Prince Sviatoslav, now a man grown and ruling in his own right, received the news with grim determination. "How many?" he asked the exhausted scout who had brought the warning. "More than the stars in the sky, my prince," the man gasped. "The Pechenegs have united under a new leader, one who claims descent from Attila himself. They say he means to rebuild the Hun Empire, starting with our lands." Sviatoslav's eyes narrowed. "Then we shall give him a welcome he won't soon forget. Send word to all our allies. The Rus stand at the crossroads of history, and we shall not falter." As messengers raced across the land, carrying word of the impending invasion, Sviatoslav turned to his advisors. "We need every advantage we can get. What of the Christians and pagans? Can they be united in our defense?" An old boyar stepped forward, his beard streaked with gray. "My prince, perhaps this threat is the very thing we need to forge a true Rus identity. Christian or pagan, Slav or Norse, we all face the same enemy." Sviatoslav nodded thoughtfully. "Gather the priests and shamans, the warriors and merchants. It's time we remind everyone what it means to be Rus." In the days that followed, Kiev became a hive of activity. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging weapons and armor. Priests and shamans performed rituals side by side, calling upon every power they knew for protection. And in the great square, Sviatoslav addressed his people. "Sons and daughters of Rus," he cried, his voice carrying to every corner of the city. "A storm approaches from the east, but we are not a people easily broken. Norse and Slav, Christian and pagan, we are all children of this land, and we will defend it with our last breath." A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of defiance that seemed to shake the very walls of Kiev. As the people dispersed to make their preparations, Sviatoslav turned to his closest advisor. "And now," he said softly, "we pray that we are enough." As the Rus prepared for war and England grappled with Ivar's conversion, a battered fleet of longships appeared on the horizon off the coast of Norway. Bjorn Ironside had returned from his quest to find Vinland, and the tales he brought with him would change everything. As Bjorn stepped ashore, his once golden hair now streaked with gray, a crowd gathered to hear his story. Among them was an aged Lagertha, her warrior spirit undimmed by the years. "My son," she said, embracing him tightly, "we feared you lost to the western seas." Bjorn's eyes sparkled with the fire of discovery. "Lost? No, mother. Found. We found it. Vinland, a new world, vaster and richer than anything we could have imagined." As Bjorn recounted his tale of endless forests, strange peoples, and lands that seemed to stretch on forever, his audience listened in awe. But it was what he said next that truly shook them. "The world is not as we thought," Bjorn declared. "It is larger, more varied, more wondrous than our oldest sagas could have dreamed. And it is changing. The old ways, the old gods, they are fading. We must adapt or perish." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement while others scowled in disapproval. But all could sense the weight of Bjorn's words, the sense that they stood on the brink of a new era. As news of Bjorn's discovery spread, it reached the ears of his brothers. Ivar, newly baptized and seeking to solidify his Christian kingdom, saw an opportunity to expand his power across the sea. Ubi, ever the peacemaker, dreamed of a new Viking homeland far from the conflicts of the old world. And in Kiev, Sviatoslav received the news with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. A new world could mean new allies, new resources, or new enemies. But there was no time to fully contemplate the implications of Bjorn's voyage. For on the eastern horizon, the dust clouds of the approaching Pecheneg horde were visible. The great battle that would decide the fate of the Rus was at hand. As the armies gathered on the vast plain outside Kiev, the air thrummed with tension. On one side, the combined forces of the Rus, Norse warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with Slavic tribesmen, Christian knights beside pagan berserkers. On the other, the seemingly endless ranks of the Pecheneg horde, their horsehair standards snapping in the wind. Sviatoslav rode before his troops, his voice carrying across the assembled host. "Today we fight not just for our lives, but for our very identity. We are Rus, children of the river and the steppe, heirs to both Norse and Slavic traditions. And we will not be erased from history." A roar went up from the Rus army, a sound of defiance that seemed to shake the very earth. And then, with a thunder of hooves and a clash of steel on steel, the battle was joined. For hours, the fate of Eastern Europe hung in the balance. The Pecheneg horsemen crashed against the Rus shield wall like waves against a cliff, only to be driven back by storms of arrows and the fierce counterattacks of the Varangian Guard. As the sun began to set, painting the battlefield in hues of red and gold, Sviatoslav found himself face to face with the Pecheneg Khan. The two leaders, each bloodied and exhausted, circled each other warily. "You fight well, Rus," the Khan growled, "but you cannot stand against the tide of history. The steppes will claim all in the end." Sviatoslav's eyes blazed with inner fire. "The steppes may claim much," he replied, "but they will never claim our spirit. We are forging something new here, something that will outlast both your horde and the empires of old." With a roar, the two men clashed, their duel becoming the focal point of the entire battle. And as they fought, it seemed as if the very fate of nations hung on the outcome of their personal combat. In that moment, as steel rang against steel and the dust of the battlefield swirled around them, the prophecy of the ancient seer echoed across time and space. The blood of Ragnar Lothbrok, flowing through Sviatoslav's veins, was indeed shaping the fate of nations. And far to the west, in England and Norway, Ivar and Bjorn felt a shiver run down their spines, as if some great and terrible destiny was unfolding. The twilight of the gods had come, and with it, a battle that would reshape the world. As night fell over the battlefield, the outcome still hung in the balance. The Rus fought with the desperation of those defending their homes and their very identity. The Pechenegs pressed on, driven by the dream of empire and the fierce traditions of the steppe. And in the gathering darkness, as the clash of arms began to fade, and the moans of the wounded rose on the night air, all knew that whatever the outcome, the world would never be the same again. The age of Vikings was ending, but what would rise to take its place remained to be seen. The fate of both the Viking and Rus worlds, and perhaps of all Europe, would be decided in the coming dawn. And as the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the struggles of mortals below, the stage was set for a conclusion that would echo through the ages. The great hall of Kiev buzzed with an energy not felt in generations. Warriors from across the Ruslands, battle-hardened veterans of the Pecheneg invasion, mingled with Norse emissaries and Slavic chieftains. At the center of it all stood Prince Vladimir, grandson of Igor and great-grandson of Rurik, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "My friends," Vladimir's voice boomed across the hall, silencing the chatter. "We stand at the threshold of a new age. Our victory over the Pechenegs has shown the world the strength of the Rus. But now we face a different kind of challenge." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "Word has reached us that Ivar the Boneless, ruler of much of England and last of Ragnar's sons, lies on his deathbed. He calls for his brothers, for one last campaign to secure their legacy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Bjorn Ironside, the legendary explorer, had passed years ago. Vitserk had fallen in battle against the Saxons. Ubi had sailed west, never to return. Ivar was indeed the last. "And so," Vladimir continued, "we shall answer that call, not just as kinsmen to the House of Lothbrok, but as Rus. We will show the world that the blood of Vikings and Slavs flows together in our veins, creating something greater than either alone." As preparations for the great expedition began, Kiev hummed with activity. Craftsmen worked day and night, forging weapons and armor that blended Norse and Slavic designs. Scholars gathered in the newly built libraries, recording the histories and sagas of both peoples. In the markets, traders from as far as Constantinople and Baghdad haggled over goods, their languages mixing in a vibrant cacophony. Amidst this bustle, Vladimir found a quiet moment with his advisor, the elderly monk Nestor. "Tell me, old friend," the prince said, "do you think we do the right thing, answering the call of a dying pagan king?" Nestor stroked his beard thoughtfully. "My prince, the ways of God are mysterious. Perhaps this journey is meant to bring the light of Christ to those still in darkness. Or perhaps it is simply the closing of one chapter of history, so that another may begin." Vladimir nodded, his eyes distant. "Either way, change is coming. I can feel it in my bones." As the Rus fleet prepared to set sail, a sense of destiny hung in the air. This would be more than a military campaign. It would be a meeting of worlds, a forging of a new identity that would shape the future of Eastern Europe. The cold winds of the North Sea buffeted the Rus ships as they approached the English coast. On the lead vessel, Vladimir stood at the prow, his cloak whipping about him. Beside him was Sveinald, a grizzled Varangian warrior who had served 3 generations of Rus princes. "There," Sveinald pointed, "the banners of Ivar's kingdom. It seems they've been expecting us." As the fleet docked, they were met by a delegation led by a tall, one-eyed warrior. "Welcome, kinsman," he called out in accented Norse. "I am Sigurd Snake in the Eye, son of Ivar. My father awaits you in his hall." The great hall of York was a far cry from the wooden structures Vladimir remembered from his youth. Stone walls rose imposingly, adorned with tapestries depicting both Norse and Christian imagery, and there, upon a bed draped in furs, lay the legendary Ivar the Boneless. Time had not been kind to the once fearsome warrior. His body, always frail, now seemed almost translucent, his bones visible beneath papery skin. But his eyes still burned with an inner fire. So, Ivar's voice was a rasp, but it carried easily in the hushed hall. The blood of Rurik answers the call of Ragnar. Come closer, young prince. Let me look upon the future of our people. Vladimir approached, bowing his head in respect. Great Ivar, your legend reaches even to the banks of the Dnieper. We have come to honor your call and to forge a new alliance between our realms. Ivar's laugh turned into a hacking cough. Alliance? Oh my boy, I have called you here for something far greater. Something that will shake the very foundations of the world we've built. The old king's eyes darted to his son. Sigurd, clear the hall. What I have to say is for the blood of Ragnar and Rurik alone. As the hall emptied, leaving only Vladimir, Sigurd, and a handful of their closest advisors, Ivar struggled to sit up. Listen well, for I will not have the strength to repeat this. Everything we have believed, everything we have fought for, it has all been based on a lie. A shocked silence fell over the room. Ivar continued, his voice growing stronger as he unburdened himself of a secret long held. Ragnar Lothbrok, our father, the man whose legend inspired generations of Vikings, was no son of Odin. He was a farmer's boy blessed with cunning and ambition, who forged his own legend through sheer force of will. Sigurd staggered back as if struck. Father, what are you saying? This cannot be true. Ivar's eyes flashed. It is true, my son. I learned it from Ragnar's own lips before he sailed to his death in England. He made me swear to keep the secret, to protect the legend that had inspired so many. But now, as I feel the cold hand of death upon me, I cannot take this truth to my grave. Vladimir, his mind reeling, found his voice. But why tell us this now? Why shatter the foundation of everything your people have built? Ivar turned his fierce gaze to the Rus prince. Because, young Vladimir, the world is changing. The old gods are fading, the old ways dying. If our people are to survive, they must adapt. They must find strength not in the blood of gods, but in their own hearts and minds. The old king's voice grew softer, almost pleading. You, Vladimir of the Rus, and you, my son Sigurd, you represent the future. A future where the strength of Vikings and the wisdom of the East can blend to create something new, something powerful. As the implications of Ivar's revelation sank in, a heavy silence fell over the hall. It was Nestor, the old monk, who finally broke it. Perhaps, he said softly, this is a sign from the one true God, a call to embrace a new faith, a new way of life. Ivar's laugh was bitter. Perhaps, old man, or perhaps it is simply the last act of a dying king, trying to secure a future for his people in a world that has outgrown them. In the days that followed, as word of Ivar's revelation spread, though the full truth was kept to a select few, a sense of unease settled over the gathered forces. Vikings who had thought themselves descended from gods now questioned everything they had believed. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Vladimir made his boldest move. Standing before the combined forces of Rus and Vikings, he raised his voice to be heard by all. Brothers, we stand at a crossroads of history. The old ways are fading, but that does not mean our strength must fade with them. Ivar the Boneless has shown us that greatness comes not from divine blood, but from the fire in our hearts and the strength of our arms. A murmur ran through the crowd as Vladimir continued. I propose an alliance not just of armies, but of peoples. Let the wisdom of the East and the courage of the North combine. Let us forge a new identity, one that honors our past while embracing the future. As Vladimir's words rang out, something seemed to shift in the air. Vikings who had been eyeing the Rus with suspicion now looked at them with new interest. Rus warriors who had felt out of place among their Norse cousins stood taller, pride evident in their bearing. In his bed, Ivar watched the proceedings with a mixture of sadness and hope. As the cheers for Vladimir's speech died down, He beckoned the young prince closer. "You remind me of my father," Ivar whispered, his voice fading. "Not the legend, but the man. Cunning, ambitious, able to inspire others to greatness. Perhaps you are the one who can lead our people into this new age." With those words, Ivar the Boneless, last of Ragnar's sons, breathed his last. As the news spread through the hall, a hush fell over the assembled warriors. An era had ended, but even as they mourned, a new energy began to build. Vikings and Rus alike could sense that they stood on the brink of something momentous. The legacy of Ragnar and Rurik, of fire and ice, was not ending but transforming into something new and powerful. As the funeral pyres were lit for Ivar, Vladimir stood with Sigurd, watching the flames reach towards the sky. "What now?" Sigurd asked, his voice heavy with the weight of his new responsibilities. Vladimir's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Now, my friend, we build. We take the strength of our fathers and forge it into something the world has never seen before. The age of Vikings may be ending, but the age of the Rus, that is just beginning." As the flames consumed the body of the last son of Ragnar, they seemed to illuminate a new path forward. The Christianization of the Rus would come, bringing with it profound changes. But the spirit of the Norse and the wisdom of the Slavs would live on, blending into a unique and powerful identity that would shape the future of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The saga of Ragnar and Rurik, of Vikings and Rus, was drawing to a close. The cold wind howled across the fjord, carrying with it the scent of salt and adventure. Young Ragnar Lothbrok stood at the edge of the water, his blue eyes fixed on the horizon where the forbidden island lay shrouded in mist. His father's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the rules that bound him. "The gods have declared that island cursed, boy," Earl Sigurd had growled. "No Viking sets foot there and lives to tell the tale." But Ragnar was not one for rules. At 18, his blood ran hot with the desire for glory and the call of destiny. He turned to his friend Thorstein, a wiry youth with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Tonight," Ragnar said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we take my father's ship and we raid the island." Thorstein's eyes widened. "Are you mad? Your father will have our heads." Ragnar grinned, the kind of grin that made sensible men take a step back. "Only if we're caught, my friend, and we won't be." As darkness fell, Ragnar and a small crew of like-minded young warriors slipped away from the village. The oars of Earl Sigurd's prized longship cut through the black water silently, propelling them towards the forbidden shore. The island loomed before them, a mass of jagged rocks and gnarled trees. As they beached the ship, an eerie silence fell over the group. Ragnar led the way, his axe gripped tightly in his hand. They found the village easily enough, a collection of simple huts nestled in a valley. The raid was swift and brutal. Ragnar moved like a force of nature, his axe singing a deadly song as he cut down anyone who stood in his way. As dawn broke, Ragnar and his men loaded their ship with plunder, gold, silver, and a dozen captured villagers to be sold as slaves. But as they prepared to depart, a horn sounded in the distance. "Ships!" Thorstein cried out. "At least 3 of them, coming fast." Ragnar's heart raced. He hadn't counted on the island having allies nearby. "To the oars!" he shouted. "We'll outrun them." The pursuit was relentless. As they neared their home shores, Ragnar saw a familiar ship cutting across their path. His father's second longship, with Earl Sigurd himself at the helm. "Odin's beard," Ragnar muttered. "We're in for it now." The confrontation on the beach was explosive. Earl Sigurd's face was red with fury as he bellowed at his son. "You fool! Do you know what you've done? Those ships belong to Earl Haraldsson. You've brought his wrath down upon us all." Ragnar stood his ground. "Father, look at what we've brought back. Gold, silver, slaves. More wealth than this village has seen in years." "And at what cost?" Sigurd spat. "Haraldson will demand blood for this insult." As if summoned by the Earl's words, the pursuing ships landed on the beach. Warriors poured forth, led by a statuesque shield maiden with fierce eyes and golden hair that shone like a battle standard. "I am Lagertha," she announced, her voice carrying across the beach. "Daughter of Earl Haraldson. Who among you led this raid on our protectorate?" Ragnar stepped forward, drawn to her like a moth to flame. "I did," he said, his voice steady. "I am Ragnar Lothbrok, son of Earl Sigurd." Lagertha's eyes narrowed. "Then it is you who must pay the price." What followed was a battle that would be sung about for generations. Ragnar and Lagertha clashed in a whirlwind of steel and fury, their skills evenly matched. For hours they fought, neither gaining the upper hand. As the sun began to set, both warriors stood bloodied and exhausted. Ragnar, seeing an opening, swung his axe in a mighty arc, only to have Lagertha duck beneath it and press her blade to his throat. "Yield," she commanded. Ragnar, his chest heaving, looked into her eyes and saw something there that made his heart skip a beat. "I yield," he said softly, "and I would offer you a proposition, Shield Maiden." Lagertha raised an eyebrow. "Speak quickly, raider." "Join forces with me," Ragnar said. "Together, we could raid lands your father has only dreamed of. I have ideas for a new type of ship, one that can sail farther and faster than any before." Lagertha hesitated, intrigued despite herself. "And what of the blood debt you owe?" Ragnar grinned. "I offer myself in marriage. Our union would bring peace between our clans and open new horizons for both." The negotiations that followed were tense, but in the end an agreement was reached. Ragnar and Lagertha were married, their union sealing a tentative peace. In the months that followed, Ragnar threw himself into his work. His new longship design took shape, a sleeker, more maneuverable vessel with a shallow draft that could navigate both open seas and rivers. "It's madness," Earl Sigurd grumbled as he watched his son work. "No ship can do what you claim." But Ragnar was undeterred. "The old ways are changing, father. We must change with them or be left behind." When the ship was finally completed, Ragnar named it the Sea Serpent. Its maiden voyage was a raid on a distant shore that had never before seen Viking longships. The wealth they returned with silenced even the most vocal critics. As Ragnar's fame grew, so did his family. Lagertha bore him a son, strong and healthy. They named him Bjorn. On the night of Bjorn's birth, as Ragnar held his son for the first time, a storm raged outside. Lightning split the sky, and in a moment of terrible clarity, Ragnar saw a vision of a great bear standing atop a mountain of skulls. "What is it?" Lagertha asked, seeing the look on her husband's face. Ragnar shook his head, trying to clear the image from his mind. "Nothing," he said, "just the gods welcoming our son." But in his heart, Ragnar knew. His son was destined for greatness, perhaps even greater than his own. As the years passed, Ragnar's power and influence grew. His raids reached farther and farther, bringing back riches beyond imagining. But with success came enemies. Earl Haraldson, once an ally through marriage, began to see Ragnar as a threat to his own power. Then, on a cold winter's night, tragedy struck. Earl Sigurd was found dead in his bed, his body twisted in agony. Whispers of poison spread through the village like wildfire. As Ragnar stood over his father's body, his face a mask of grief and rage, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The mantle of leadership now fell to him, along with all its burdens and dangers. "What will you do?" Lagertha asked, standing beside him. Ragnar's eyes hardened, the last traces of the impetuous youth he had once been fading away. "What I must," he said. "I will lead our people to glory, no matter the cost." The salty spray of the North Sea whipped across Ragnar's face as he stood at the prow of his longship, the Sea Serpent. His blue eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the misty shores of England awaited. Behind him, a fleet of Viking ships cut through the waves, their dragon-headed prows striking fear into the hearts of any who beheld them. "Land ho!" came the cry from the lookout. Ragnar allowed himself a small smile. "Prepare to make landfall," he commanded. "And remember, we strike swiftly and silently. The Saxons will never know what hit them." As the ships beached on the rocky shore, Ragnar led his warriors inland. They moved like shadows through the early morning mist, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The first sign of civilization they encountered was a small monastery, its stone walls rising out of the fog like a specter. "There," Ragnar whispered to his men, "our first prize." The attack was brutally efficient. The monks, caught completely unawares, barely had time to cry out before the Vikings were upon them. Ragnar moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his axe rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. As the dust settled and his men began to gather the monastery's treasures, Ragnar noticed movement behind the altar. Drawing his sword, he approached cautiously. To his surprise, he found a young monk cowering there, clutching a beautifully illuminated book to his chest. "Please," the monk whimpered in broken Norse, "I beg you, spare me." Ragnar's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You speak our tongue?" The monk nodded frantically. "I am Athelstan. I have studied many languages to better serve God." Something about the young man's earnestness gave Ragnar pause. Instead of striking him down, he grabbed Athelstan by the scruff of his neck and hauled him to his feet. "You'll fetch a good price as a slave," Ragnar declared. "And perhaps you can teach me more about your Christian God and this land of yours." As they prepared to leave, laden with gold, silver, and other treasures, the sound of horns echoed across the countryside. The Saxons had finally mobilized a response. "To the ships!" Ragnar roared. The retreat was chaotic but orderly. Ragnar's men fought off the pursuing Saxons as they loaded their plunder onto the longships. As they pushed off from shore, Ragnar stood at the stern, watching the English coastline recede. "This is only the beginning," he murmured to himself. "We will return, and next time, we'll take more than just a monastery." The journey home was triumphant. Word of Ragnar's successful raid spread quickly, and by the time they reached the shores of their homeland, crowds had gathered to welcome the victorious warriors. But not everyone was pleased with Ragnar's success. Earl Haraldsson, once Ragnar's ally through marriage, watched the celebrations with narrowed eyes and a bitter taste in his mouth. "Look at him," Haraldsson spat to his advisors, "acting as if he's already Earl. He forgets his place." As Ragnar made his way through the crowd, basking in their adulation, he found himself face to face with Haraldsson. The Earl's smile was as cold as a winter storm. "Congratulations on your successful raid, Ragnar Lothbrok," Haraldsson said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I trust you'll be sharing the spoils with those who made your journey possible?" Ragnar's eyes hardened. "Of course, Earl Haraldsson. You'll receive your due share, as is custom." The tension between the two men was palpable, a silent battle of wills that everyone around them could feel. It was Lagertha who broke the standoff, stepping between them with a disarming smile. "Come, husband," she said, taking Ragnar's arm. "Let us go home and properly celebrate your victory." As they made their way back to their farmstead, Ragnar couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. He had tasted true victory, true power, and he knew that Haraldsson would never willingly let him rise any further. Weeks passed, and life seemed to return to normal. Ragnar spent his days working the land and planning his next raid, while Lagertha tended to their home and young Bjorn. The English monk Athelstan had been put to work as a house slave, though Ragnar often engaged him in long conversations about the world beyond their shores. One night, as Ragnar lay sleeping, he was jolted awake by the sound of Lagertha's voice. "Intruders!" she hissed, already on her feet with her shield and sword in hand. Ragnar leapt up, grabbing his axe. "How many?" "At least 5, Lagertha replied. "I saw them skulking around the barn." Ragnar's mind raced. 5 against 2 weren't great odds, but he and Lagertha were no ordinary warriors. "I'll take the front, you circle around back," he began, but Lagertha was already shaking her head. "No," she said firmly. "You stay here with Bjorn. I'll handle this." Before Ragnar could protest, Lagertha was out the door, moving like a wraith through the moonlit yard. Ragnar watched in awe as his wife engaged the attackers single-handedly. Her sword flashed in the darkness, and her shield rang out as it deflected blows. Within minutes it was over. 4 bodies lay still on the ground, and a 5th figure was fleeing into the night. Lagertha returned to the house, blood-spattered but unharmed. "It's done," she said simply. Ragnar embraced her fiercely. "You are truly a gift from the gods," he murmured. As they disposed of the bodies, Ragnar couldn't shake the feeling that this attack was no random occurrence. The men had been too well armed, too purposeful in their approach. This had been a calculated strike meant to eliminate him and his family. "Haraldsson," he growled. "It has to be." Lagertha placed a hand on his arm. "We have no proof," she cautioned, "and accusing an earl of such a thing is dangerous." Ragnar nodded, but his mind was made up. The time for playing by the old rules was over. If he was to secure a future for himself and his family, he would need to take bold action. That night, as Ragnar finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with strange and portentous visions. He saw himself standing atop a great mountain, looking out over a vast empire. Beside him stood a one-eyed man, tall and regal, with a raven perched on each shoulder. "Who are you?" Ragnar asked in the dream. The one-eyed man turned to him, his single eye burning with an otherworldly light. "You know who I am, Ragnar Lothbrok. The real question is, do you know who you are?" Ragnar awoke with a start, his heart pounding. The dream had felt more real than any he had ever experienced. He knew, deep in his bones, that he had been visited by Odin himself. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Ragnar sat up, his mind racing with the implications of the dream. He had always known he was destined for greatness, but now he felt the weight of divine purpose settling on his shoulders. "What troubles you, husband?" Lagertha asked, stirring beside him. Ragnar turned to her, his eyes blazing with a newfound determination. "Nothing troubles me," he said, "but everything is about to change. The gods have shown me our path, and it leads to glory beyond imagining." As Ragnar spoke, he could almost hear the threads of fate being woven around him. The raid on England had been just the beginning. The great hall of Kattegat buzzed with tension as Ragnar Lothbrok strode through the crowd, his blue eyes fixed on Earl Haraldsson. The air was thick with the scent of mead and sweat, and the low murmur of voices fell to a hush as Ragnar approached the high seat. "Earl Haraldsson," Ragnar's voice rang out, clear and strong. "I challenge you to single combat for control of the earldom." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Haraldsson's face twisted with rage and fear. "You dare challenge me, Lothbrok? You forget your place." Ragnar's lips curled into a wolfish grin. "My place is where the gods will it, and they have shown me that it is time for a change in leadership." Haraldsson stood, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Very well. Tomorrow at midday we shall settle this like men of honor." As the sun reached its zenith the following day, the people of Kattegat gathered in a wide circle. Ragnar and Haraldsson faced each other, their weapons glinting in the harsh light. The fight was brutal and swift. Haraldsson, for all his years of experience, found himself outmatched by Ragnar's speed and ferocity. In a matter of minutes, Ragnar's axe found its mark, and Haraldsson fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Ragnar stood over his fallen foe, his chest heaving. "It is done," he declared. "I am your earl now." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Ragnar's eyes sought out Lagertha. She stood at the edge of the circle, her face a mix of pride and concern. She knew, as he did, that this was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Ragnar wasted no time in expanding his power. With his new title secure, he launched a series of daring raids on the shores of Francia. His longships, faster and more maneuverable than any before, struck fear into the hearts of the Frankish people. Returning from one such raid, laden with gold and silver, Ragnar addressed his people. "The gods have blessed us with great victories," he proclaimed, "but we must not grow complacent. There are still lands to the west that have never known the touch of Viking steel." As Ragnar's fame grew, so did the whispers of his connection to the gods. Many believed he was favored by Odin himself, a notion Ragnar did little to discourage. But with great power came great temptation. During a diplomatic mission to Götaland, Ragnar encountered Princess Aslaug, a woman of renowned beauty and mystical abilities. Their meeting was electric, filled with an intensity that left Ragnar breathless. "You are destined for greatness, Ragnar Lothbrok," Aslaug murmured, her eyes seeming to peer into his very soul. "But your path is fraught with danger and difficult choices." Ragnar, entranced by her words and beauty, made a fateful decision. He took Aslaug as his second wife, bringing her back to Kattegat. The return was not the joyous occasion he had anticipated. Lagertha stood at the docks, her face a mask of fury and betrayal, as she saw Aslaug by Ragnar's side. "What is this?" Lagertha demanded, her voice cutting through the sea air. Ragnar stepped forward, his heart heavy. "Lagertha, this is Princess Aslaug. She is to be my second wife." The slap echoed across the harbor. Lagertha's eyes blazed with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "How dare you?" she hissed. "After everything we've been through, everything we've built together." Ragnar reached for her, but Lagertha stepped back. "Don't," she warned. "You've made your choice, Ragnar. Now you must live with it." In the days that followed, a palpable tension settled over Kattegat. Ragnar found himself torn between his love for Lagertha and his growing fascination with Aslaug. The situation came to a head when Bjorn, now a young man, confronted his father. "How could you do this to Mother?" Bjorn demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. Ragnar sighed heavily. "It's complicated, son. The gods—" "Don't speak to me of the gods," Bjorn interrupted. "This isn't about the gods. This is about your own selfish desires." The words stung Ragnar more than he cared to admit. "Bjorn, please try to understand." But Bjorn was already turning away. "I'm leaving with Mother," he said, his voice cold. "I won't stay here and watch you destroy everything we once had." Ragnar felt as if his heart was being torn from his chest. He wanted to run after his son, to beg forgiveness, but his pride held him back. He watched in silence as Lagertha and Bjorn packed their belongings and left Kattegat, taking a piece of his soul with them. In the wake of their departure, Ragnar threw himself into his role as Earl with renewed vigor. He led more raids, pushed his people to explore further than ever before. But there was a hollowness to his victories now, a sense that something essential was missing. Aslaug, for her part, did her best to fill the void left by Lagertha and Bjorn. She was a capable advisor and a comforting presence, but Ragnar could never quite shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. Months passed, and Aslaug's belly swelled with child. As her time drew near, she began to have strange dreams and visions. "The child will be special," she told Ragnar. "The gods have shown me." When the time came for the birth, a terrible storm raged outside. Ragnar paced anxiously as Aslaug's cries of pain echoed through the hall. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, a new sound joined the cacophony, the wail of a newborn babe. Ragnar burst into the room, eager to see his new child. But as the midwife placed the infant in his arms, his heart sank. The boy's legs were twisted and malformed, a sight that filled Ragnar with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "His name is Ivar," Aslaug said weakly from the bed, "and he will be the most famous of all your sons." Ragnar looked down at the child, his mind racing. He remembered the prophecies, the warnings of difficult choices and dangerous paths. Was this what the gods had meant? As he held his deformed son, Ragnar felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this child would change everything. For better or worse, Ivar's birth marked the beginning of a new chapter in the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Outside, the storm raged on, as if the very heavens were heralding the arrival of this strange and fateful child. Ragnar stood by the window, cradling Ivar in his arms, and gazed out into the darkness. The future, once so clear, now seemed shrouded in mystery. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, his voice lost in the howling wind. "What have I set in motion?" But there was no answer, save for the rumble of thunder and the soft whimpers of the child in his arms. Ragnar Lothbrok, Earl of Kattegat, favored of the gods, stood on the precipice of a new and uncertain future, with only his wits and his courage to guide him through the storms to come. The mead hall of Kattegat echoed with the sounds of celebration. Ragnar Lothbrok, now a powerful earl and renowned explorer, sat at the high table, his eyes scanning the crowd. His gaze fell upon his brother Rollo, who sat apart from the festivities, brooding over his ale. Ragnar approached his brother, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Why so glum, brother? We have much to celebrate." Rollo looked up, his eyes dark with barely concealed resentment. "Celebrate what, Ragnar? Your glory? Your fame? What of those who stand in your shadow?" Ragnar's smile faltered. "Rollo, you are my brother. My victories are your victories." "Are they?" Rollo spat. "I am always the afterthought, the footnote in the great saga of Ragnar Lothbrok." Before Ragnar could respond, a messenger burst into the hall, his face pale with urgency. "Earl Ragnar, ships approach from Gotaland. They fly the banners of war." The hall erupted into chaos as warriors scrambled for their weapons. Ragnar turned to Rollo, extending his hand. "Brother, we need you. Fight with us." Rollo stared at the offered hand for a long moment before turning away. "I have made my choice, Ragnar. As have you." As Ragnar led his forces to the shore, he was shocked to see Rollo standing among the enemy ranks, his face set in grim determination. "Rollo," Ragnar called out, his voice carrying across the beach. "What madness is this?" Rollo's response was cold. "This is my chance to step out of your shadow, brother. Today, I forge my own destiny." The battle that followed was brutal and chaotic. Viking fought Viking, brother against brother. Ragnar found himself in the thick of the fighting, his axe rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. As the tide of battle turned in Ragnar's favor, he spotted Rollo cutting a path towards him. The two brothers clashed in a whirlwind of steel and fury, their skills evenly matched. "Why, Rollo?" Ragnar grunted as their weapons locked. "Why betray your own blood?" Rollo's eyes blazed with a mix of anger and pain. "Because I will never be anything but Ragnar's brother. I want my own name, my own legend." Their duel raged on, neither willing to yield. But Ragnar's greater skill eventually won out. With a mighty blow, he disarmed Rollo and knocked him to the ground. Ragnar stood over his fallen brother, axe raised for the killing blow. But as he looked into Rollo's eyes, he hesitated. In that moment of mercy, one of Rollo's allies struck, driving a spear deep into Ragnar's side. Ragnar stumbled back, blood pouring from the wound. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Rollo's face, a mixture of shock and regret etched upon it. When Ragnar awoke days later, he found himself in his bed, tended to by Athelstan, the monk-turned-advisor he had captured years ago in England. "You are fortunate to be alive, my lord," Athelstan said softly. "The wound was grave, but the gods smiled upon you." Ragnar grimaced as he tried to sit up. "Was it the gods, Athelstan? Or was it your Christian god?" Athelstan paused in his ministrations. "Perhaps it was both, my lord. The God I believe in does not deny the existence of your gods. He simply claims to be above them all." Ragnar's brow furrowed. "Tell me more of this god of yours, Athelstan. I find myself curious." As Ragnar recovered, he and Athelstan spent long hours in discussion. The monk spoke of a god of love and forgiveness, of sacrifice and redemption. Ragnar listened, sometimes scoffing, sometimes thoughtful. Your god seems weak, Ragnar mused one evening, always turning the other cheek. How does he inspire men to greatness? Athelstan smiled. There are many forms of greatness, my lord. Not all require the spilling of blood. These conversations planted seeds of doubt in Ragnar's mind, making him question the beliefs he had held his entire life. But rather than weaken him, this uncertainty seemed to sharpen his wits, making him even more unpredictable and dangerous. As soon as he was able, Ragnar began planning his most ambitious raid yet, an attack on the great city of Paris. His captains thought him mad. Paris is impregnable, one argued. Its walls have never fallen to Viking raiders. Ragnar's eyes gleamed with the fire of inspiration. Then we shall do what has never been done before. We will not just raid Paris, we will conquer it. His plan was audacious and unconventional. While part of his force engaged the Frankish defenders at the walls, Ragnar led a small group up the river Seine in boats disguised as merchant vessels. As dawn broke, the Parisians were shocked to find Vikings inside their supposedly impenetrable defenses. The sacking of Paris was swift and brutal. Ragnar's name, already feared throughout the Christian world, now took on an almost mythical quality. He returned to Kattegat laden with riches beyond imagining, expecting to be greeted as a returning hero. Instead, he found his earldom in turmoil. In his long absence, rival clans had begun to challenge his authority. Whispers of rebellion echoed through the streets of Kattegat. As Ragnar made his way to the great hall, he overheard two men talking in hushed tones. Ragnar has been gone too long, one said. He cares more for foreign conquests than for his own people. Aye, the other agreed. Perhaps it's time for new leadership, someone who will put Kattegat first. Ragnar's jaw clenched as he pushed open the doors to the hall. Inside, he found a group of rival chieftains gathered, their conversation falling silent as he entered. Well, Ragnar said, his voice dangerously soft. It seems I've returned just in time. Tell me, my friends, what concerns do you bring before your earl? One of the chieftains, a burly man named Ulf, stepped forward. Ragnar Lothbrok, we mean no disrespect. But in your absence, our people have suffered. Crops have failed. Raids from rival clans have increased. We need a leader who is present, not one who is always looking to the horizon. Ragnar's eyes narrowed. And you think you could do better, Ulf? You, who have never seen the world beyond our fjords? Ulf straightened, emboldened by the nods of his fellows. Perhaps it is time for someone who cares more for our people than for personal glory. The hall fell silent, the tension palpable. Ragnar's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, but he stopped himself. Violence would only prove their point. Instead, he spread his arms wide, gesturing to the wealth he had brought back. Look around you. The riches of Paris lie at your feet. I have brought glory and prosperity to Kattegat. But if you think you can do better, by all means challenge me, here and now. No one moved. Despite their grumblings, none dared to face Ragnar in combat. Ragnar's lips curled into a cold smile. No? Then let us speak no more of rebellion. There is work to be done, my friends. Kattegat will become the center of a great empire, and you will all share in its glory. But cross me again, and you will wish for the mercy of my axe. As the chastened chieftains filed out, Ragnar sank into his high seat, suddenly feeling the weight of his wounds and his years. He had won the day, but he knew the whispers would not die so easily. Athelstan approached, concern etched on his face. My lord, perhaps it is time to consider a different approach. Your people need more than just riches and glory. They need stability, guidance. Ragnar looked at his advisor, a wry smile on his lips. Are you suggesting I turn to your gentle Christ, Athelstan? Become a king of peace rather than war? Athelstan shook his head. I suggest only that there may be a middle path, one that brings both glory and prosperity to your people. Ragnar leaned back, his mind racing with possibilities. The challenges before him were great, but so too were the opportunities. as he sat there plotting his next move. He couldn't shake the feeling that he stood on the precipice of something truly momentous. "Very well, Athelstan," he said at last. "Show me this middle path of yours. But know this. I am Ragnar Lothbrok, and whatever path I choose, it will be one that echoes through the ages." As night fell over Kattegat, Ragnar stood at the window of his hall, gazing out at the fjord. The future was uncertain, fraught with danger and possibility in equal measure. The great hall of Kattegat buzzed with anticipation as the jarls and chieftains of Denmark gathered. Ragnar Lothbrok stood before them, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. The years had etched lines into his face, but his blue eyes still burned with the same intensity that had first led him across the sea to raid distant lands. "My fellow Danes," Ragnar's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. "For too long, we have been divided. Petty rivalries and old grudges have kept us from achieving true greatness. But no more. Today, we unite under one banner, one crown." A chorus of cheers and thumping of shields filled the hall. Ragnar raised his hand for silence. "I stand before you not as a conqueror but as a unifier. Together we will forge a kingdom that will be the envy of the world. Who stands with me?" One by one the jarls stepped forward, pledging their loyalty to Ragnar. As the last oath was sworn, Ragnar's closest advisor, the former monk Athelstan, approached with a golden crown. "All hail Ragnar, King of Denmark," Athelstan proclaimed, placing the crown upon Ragnar's head. The hall erupted in cheers, but as Ragnar gazed out at his new subjects, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The weight of the crown felt heavier than any burden he had ever borne. In the years that followed, Ragnar worked tirelessly to solidify his rule and expand his kingdom. His sons, now grown into fierce warriors themselves, became both his greatest strength and his most pressing concern. Bjorn Ironside, his firstborn, had returned from his self-imposed exile and quickly proved himself a formidable leader. Ubbe, steady and thoughtful, became a voice of reason in Ragnar's council. Hvitserk's wild spirit made him an unpredictable but effective raider. And Ivar, despite his twisted legs, possessed a ruthless intelligence that both impressed and unsettled Ragnar. One evening, as Ragnar watched his sons spar in the training yard, Aslaug approached. Her beauty had only grown with age, and her eyes held the mysterious gleam of one touched by the gods. "They grow stronger every day," Aslaug observed. "But be wary, my king. I see storm clouds on the horizon." Ragnar frowned. "What do you mean, woman? Speak plainly." Aslaug's gaze seemed to look beyond the physical world. "I see a great battle, Ragnar. Blood on English soil, and defeat." Ragnar scoffed, but a seed of doubt had been planted. "Nonsense. We have raided England many times. This time will be no different." But as Ragnar prepared for his next great raid on England, he couldn't shake Aslaug's warning. He gathered his sons and his most trusted warriors, determined to lead them to glory once more. The raid, however, proved disastrous from the start. The English were prepared, their defenses stronger than ever. Ragnar's longships were scattered by a fierce storm, and those that made it to shore were met with a wall of Saxon shields and spears. Ragnar fought like a man possessed, his axe rising and falling in a deadly arc. But for every Saxon that fell, two more seemed to take his place. As night fell, Ragnar found himself surrounded, cut off from the bulk of his forces. "Father," Bjorn's voice cut through the chaos. "We must retreat. The tide is turning against us." Ragnar hesitated, his pride warring with his tactical mind. In that moment of indecision, an English arrow found its mark, piercing his shoulder. The great Ragnar Lothbrok fell to one knee, his vision blurring. The retreat was chaotic and costly. As they sailed back to Denmark, Ragnar sat in brooding silence, the pain of his wound nothing compared to the ache in his heart. For the first time in his life he had tasted true defeat. Upon their return to Kattegat, the mood was somber. Ragnar isolated himself in the great hall, refusing to see anyone but Athelstan. I failed them, old friend, Ragnar muttered, staring into the depths of his mead cup. My people, my sons. I led them to disaster. Athelstan placed a comforting hand on Ragnar's shoulder. Every great leader faces setbacks, my king. It is how you rise from them that defines you. But Ragnar seemed unable to shake off the weight of his failure. He began to withdraw from public life, spending long hours alone or in hushed conversations with Aslaug, whose visions grew more frequent and dire. One night, as a storm raged outside, Aslaug burst into Ragnar's chambers, her eyes wild with fear. I have seen it, Ragnar, she gasped. The end of everything we have built. Our sons turning against each other, Kattegat in flames, and you. You were nowhere to be found. Ragnar gripped Aslaug's arms, his face a mask of anguish. What would you have me do? How can I prevent this? Aslaug's voice was barely a whisper. You must leave, my love. For the sake of our sons, for the sake of our people. Your presence here will only hasten the doom I have foreseen. Ragnar recoiled as if struck. Leave? Abandon my kingdom, my family. Not abandon, Aslaug insisted. Protect. Give them a chance to forge their own paths without your shadow looming over them. For days, Ragnar wrestled with this impossible choice. He watched his sons from afar, seeing the men they were becoming. Bjorn, already a leader in his own right. Ubi, wise beyond his years. Hvitserk, eager to prove himself. And Ivar, whose ambition seemed to know no bounds. Finally, on a moonless night, Ragnar made his decision. He left a single note for Athelstan, entrusting him with the care of his family and kingdom. Then, with nothing but the clothes on his back and his trusty axe, Ragnar Lothbrok slipped away into the darkness. The disappearance of the great king sent shockwaves through Denmark. Searches were mounted, rewards offered, but Ragnar had vanished as completely as if Odin himself had spirited him away to Valhalla. In the vacuum left by Ragnar's absence, chaos quickly took root. His sons, once united under their father's rule, began to quarrel amongst themselves. Old rivalries between the Danish tribes resurfaced, threatening to tear apart the fragile unity Ragnar had forged. Bjorn, as the eldest, tried to maintain order. Our father may be gone, he proclaimed to the assembled jarls, but his vision for a united Denmark lives on through us. We must stand together, or everything he built will crumble. But even as Bjorn spoke, he could see the doubt in the eyes of the assembled leaders. Without Ragnar's legendary presence to bind them, the old ways of division and conflict were reasserting themselves. Ivar, his eyes gleaming with ambition, saw opportunity in the chaos. Perhaps it is time for new leadership, he suggested, his voice smooth as silk. Someone who can lead us into a new era of greatness. The tension in the hall was palpable, the first hints of the conflict Aslaug had foreseen beginning to take shape. As months turned to years with no sign of Ragnar's return, the kingdom he had built began to fracture. Raiders from rival lands, once held at bay by fear of Ragnar's retribution, grew bold once more. The people of Kattegat, once proud subjects of a unified Denmark, now lived in fear of what each new day might bring. Athelstan, true to his promise, did his best to guide the fractious sons of Ragnar and maintain some semblance of order. But even he could see that without Ragnar, the future of Denmark hung by a thread. On a cliffside overlooking the sea, Aslaug stood alone, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for a ghost. Where are you, Ragnar? She whispered to the wind. Your people need you. Your sons need you. I need you. But only the crash of waves against the rocks answered her plea. Ragnar Lothbrok, the king who had united Denmark, the scourge of England and Francia, had vanished into legend. The mists of dawn were just beginning to lift over Kattegat when a solitary figure appeared on the horizon. Clad in tattered furs, his once golden hair now streaked with gray, Ragnar Lothbrok walked the path to his former kingdom. His blue eyes, once aflame with ambition, now held a haunted, distant look. As he entered the town, whispers spread like wildfire. It's him! The king has returned. Ragnar lives. Bjorn Ironside, now a man in his prime, was the first to confront the apparition of his father. He stood before Ragnar, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Father?" Bjorn's voice was a mixture of disbelief and barely contained anger. "Is it really you?" Ragnar nodded slowly, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Hello, son. You've grown." The reunion that followed was tense and fraught with unspoken recriminations. Ragnar's sons gathered around him, each eyeing their long-lost father with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Ubi, ever the peacemaker, was the first to embrace Ragnar. "Welcome home, father. We thought you dead." Hvitserk circled Ragnar warily. "Where have you been all these years? Why did you abandon us?" Ivar, dragging himself forward on his crutches, fixed Ragnar with a penetrating stare. "Have you come to reclaim your throne, old man? Or just to die?" Ragnar looked at each of his sons in turn, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My boys," he said softly. "How you've grown. I've heard tales of your exploits even in my exile. The sons of Ragnar, they say, are more fearsome than their father ever was." Bjorn's eyes narrowed. "And what of it? We had to become strong to survive in your absence. Denmark nearly tore itself apart when you left." Ragnar nodded, a look of genuine remorse crossing his weathered features. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm here now, and I have one last journey to make. One last chance for glory that will echo through the ages." The sons exchanged glances, suspicion warring with curiosity. It was Ivar who spoke first, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And what great quest does the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok propose?" Ragnar's eyes gleamed with a familiar fire. "England. We will strike at the heart of Northumbria, at King Aelle himself, the man who has long been a thorn in our side." A murmur ran through the gathered warriors. England had become a formidable foe in recent years, its defenses strengthened against Viking raids. But the prospect of such a high-profile target was tempting. Bjorn shook his head. "It's madness. England is too well defended now. We'd be sailing to our deaths." But Ragnar was not to be dissuaded. Over the coming days, he worked his old magic, playing on his son's desires and insecurities. To Bjorn, he promised a chance to outshine his father's legend. To Ubbe, the opportunity to prove his worth as a leader. To Hvitserk, the thrill of battle and glory. And to Ivar, he whispered of strategies that would cement his reputation as the most cunning of Vikings. Slowly but surely, Ragnar's sons came around to his plan. Ships were prepared, warriors gathered. The great army of the sons of Ragnar made ready to sail for England. As they stood on the docks preparing to depart, Aslaug approached Ragnar. Her eyes, still sharp with the power of prophecy, were filled with unshed tears. "You know what awaits you in England, don't you?" she asked softly. Ragnar nodded, his face set in grim determination. "I do, but it must be this way." Aslaug touched his cheek gently. "Then go, my love. May the gods watch over you." The journey to England was fraught with omens. Storms battered the longships and ravens circled overhead, their cries seeming to carry messages from Odin himself. When they finally made landfall on English soil, it was in the midst of a howling gale. Ragnar led his sons and their warriors inland. But something was off. The countryside seemed too quiet, too empty. It wasn't until they were deep in Northumbrian territory that the trap was sprung. King Aelle's forces appeared as if from nowhere, surrounding the Viking army. In the chaos that followed, Ragnar was separated from his sons. He fought like a man possessed, his axe claiming English lives with every swing. But for every Saxon that fell, 2 more took his place. As night fell, Ragnar found himself alone, cornered by a group of English soldiers. He fought on, even as wounds accumulated on his aging body. Just as it seemed he would be overwhelmed, a figure burst through the English lines. Ivar, crawling with inhuman speed, his face contorted in a battle frenzy. "Father!" Ivar cried out, take my hand." For a moment Ragnar hesitated. Then, to Ivar's shock, he shook his head. "No, my son. This is where our paths diverge." Before Ivar could protest, Ragnar turned and allowed himself to be captured by the English. The last thing Ivar saw was his father being led away, head held high even in defeat. Ragnar was brought before King Aella, battered but unbowed. The Northumbrian king sneered down at his captive. "So, the great Ragnar Lothbrok is finally within my grasp. How the mighty have fallen." Ragnar's laugh was like the rasp of steel on stone. "You think this is my fall, Aella? No, this is my ascension." Confused and angered by Ragnar's defiance, Aella ordered a gruesome execution. A pit was dug and filled with venomous snakes. Ragnar, stripped of his armor and weapons, was to be lowered into it. As he stood at the edge of the pit, Ragnar's voice rang out clear and strong. "Odin, I come to you. But know this, my sons will avenge me. The name of Ragnar Lothbrok will haunt you and your descendants for generations to come." With those words, Ragnar Lothbrok, once king of Denmark and terror of the Christian world, stepped willingly into the pit of snakes. His death cries echoed across the English countryside, a sound that would live in infamy. News of Ragnar's execution spread like wildfire throughout the Viking world. In Kattegat, his sons received the news with a mixture of grief and rage. Bjorn, his voice choked with emotion, addressed the assembled warriors. "Our father is dead, murdered by the cowardly King Aelle, but his death will not go unavenged. We, the sons of Ragnar, will raise an army the likes of which this world has never seen. We will paint England red with Saxon blood." The roar of approval that followed shook the very foundations of Kattegat. Warriors from all across Scandinavia pledged their support, eager to be part of the vengeance of Ragnar Lothbrok. As preparations for the great invasion began, Ivar pulled his brothers aside. His eyes gleamed with a manic light as he recounted his last encounter with their father. "Don't you see?" Ivar hissed. "Father planned this. His capture, his execution, it was all part of his final strategy. He has given us the greatest gift of all, a reason to unite, a common enemy to destroy." The other brothers exchanged uneasy glances. Had their father truly orchestrated his own death? And if so, what did that say about the man they had both loved and feared? As night fell over Kattegat, the sons of Ragnar stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The same sea that had carried their father to glory and to his doom. Each was lost in his own thoughts, contemplating the legacy they had inherited and the vengeance they would wreak. In England, King Aelle slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by Ragnar's final words. He knew in his heart of hearts that he had not seen the last of the Lothbroks. The real war was just beginning, and somewhere in the halls of Valhalla, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled. His greatest battle was won. His legend would live on through his sons, and the world would tremble at the very mention of his name for generations to come. The shores of England trembled under the weight of countless Viking longships. The great heathen army, assembled from every corner of Scandinavia, had arrived to exact vengeance for Ragnar Lothbrok. At the head of this massive force stood Bjorn Ironside and Ivar the Boneless, the eldest and youngest sons of the fallen king. Bjorn, his beard flecked with sea spray, turned to his brother. "Well, Ivar, it seems father's plan has worked. Look at the army we've gathered." Ivar, perched in his war chariot, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, nodded. "Indeed, brother. Now we shall paint this Christian land red with Saxon blood." As the Vikings made landfall, the differences in the brothers' leadership styles became immediately apparent. Bjorn favored a direct approach, advocating for a swift march on Northumbria to confront King Aelle. "We must strike while the Saxons are still reeling from our arrival," Bjorn argued in the war council. "A quick, decisive victory will demoralize them and rally more to our cause." Ivar, however, had other ideas. "No, brother. That's exactly what they'll expect. We should divide our forces, strike at multiple targets simultaneously, confuse and terrorize them before closing the trap." The debate raged on, with the other brothers and war chiefs weighing in. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The army would split, with Bjorn leading a force directly towards Northumbria, while Ivar coordinated a series of smaller raids to sow chaos across the Saxon kingdoms. As the campaign progressed, the friction between the brothers' strategies grew. Bjorn's forces won several pitched battles, driving steadily towards King Aella's stronghold. But casualties were high, and supplies were running low. "We're losing too many men," Ubbi, another of Ragnar's sons, complained to Bjorn. "Ivar's raids are effective, but they're not providing the support we need for a sustained campaign." Bjorn's face was grim as he surveyed the battlefield. "I know, but we're committed now. We push on to Northumbria, with or without Ivar's help." Meanwhile, Ivar's tactics were spreading terror throughout the Saxon lands. Villages were put to the torch, monasteries plundered, and survivors left with horrific tales of the cruel Viking leader who moved like a demon despite his twisted legs. In his war tent, Ivar pored over maps, plotting his next move. His brother Vitserk entered, looking troubled. "Ivar, word from Bjorn's camp. They're nearing Northumbria, but they're battered. They need our support." Ivar's eyes never left the map. Bjorn made his choice. Let him reap the consequences of his brute force tactics. Hvitserk shifted uncomfortably. "But brother, if Bjorn fails, then I will succeed where he could not." Ivar snapped. "Now leave me. I have a war to win." As Bjorn's forces approached King Aella's stronghold, they found themselves facing a well-prepared Saxon army. The battle that ensued was brutal and bloody. Bjorn fought like a man possessed, his axe rising and falling in a deadly arc as he cut a path through the Saxon lines. But the Vikings were outnumbered and exhausted. Just as it seemed they might be overwhelmed, war horns sounded from the east. Ivar had arrived with reinforcements, his chariot smashing into the Saxon flank. The tide of battle turned swiftly. The Saxons, caught between Bjorn's berserker rage and Ivar's cunning tactics, were routed. King Aella himself was captured as he tried to flee the battlefield. In the aftermath, the sons of Ragnar gathered to decide the fate of their father's killer. Ivar's voice cut through the debate like a knife. "There is only one fitting punishment for this Christian dog," he snarled. "The Blood Eagle." A hush fell over the assembled warriors. The Blood Eagle was an execution method so brutal that even hardened Vikings blanched at its mention. Bjorn looked at his younger brother, seeing the cold fury in his eyes. "Ivar is right," Bjorn said finally. "For our father, nothing less will suffice." The execution of King Aella was a spectacle of horror that would be spoken of in whispers for generations. As the Saxon king's lungs were pulled from his back in the shape of bloody wings, Ivar watched with a smile that chilled even his own brothers. With Northumbria fallen, the great heathen army turned its attention to the rest of England. Kingdom after kingdom fell before the Viking onslaught. Mercia, East Anglia, and large swaths of Wessex came under Norse control. Ragnar's dying prophecy was being fulfilled with terrible efficiency, but as their conquests grew, so too did the rift between the brothers. Ivar's methods became increasingly brutal, his treatment of conquered peoples bordering on sadistic. After one particularly vicious sacking of a Saxon town, Bjorn confronted his younger brother. "Enough, Ivar," Bjorn roared. "We came here for vengeance, not to become monsters." Ivar sneered up at his brother from his chariot. "Monsters? We are Vikings, Bjorn. We take what we want, by whatever means necessary." "There must be limits," Bjorn insisted. "If we're to rule these lands, we need the people to fear us, yes, but not to hate us so much they'll never stop rebelling." Ivar's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Always the politician, eh, brother? No, I say we crush them so thoroughly they'll never dare to rise against us." The argument escalated, with other brothers and war chiefs taking sides. In the end, no consensus was reached, but the seeds of a deeper conflict had been planted. As the campaign wore on, Ivar's ambition grew along with his reputation for cruelty. He began to see himself not just as a commander in the great heathen army, but as its rightful leader and the future king of all they had conquered. One night, as the army camped on the outskirts of yet another Saxon town, Ivar called his most loyal followers to his tent. "Brothers, friends," he began, his voice low and intense. "We have achieved great things here in England. But why stop with mere conquest? Why not build something lasting, something that will eclipse even our father's legacy?" His followers leaned in, eager to hear more. Ivar's eyes gleamed in the lamplight as he laid out his vision. "I see a new kingdom, spanning all of England and beyond. A Viking empire that will stand for 1,000 years. And it needs a strong leader, one who isn't afraid to do whatever is necessary to maintain power." As Ivar spoke, his brothers Ubi and Hvitserk exchanged worried glances outside the tent. They had come to eavesdrop, concerned about Ivar's growing influence. "He's going too far," Ubi whispered. "If he continues like this, he'll tear apart everything we've built." Hvitserk nodded grimly. "We need to tell Bjorn. Ivar must be stopped before his ambition destroys us all." But even as they slipped away to warn their eldest brother, both knew that confronting Ivar would not be easy. The youngest son of Ragnar had proven himself a brilliant tactician and a fearsome warrior despite his disability. Many in the army looked to him with a mixture of awe and terror. The next day, as the army prepared to march on their next target, the tension between the brothers was palpable. Bjorn, Ubi, and Hvitserk huddled together, casting wary glances at Ivar as he barked orders from his chariot. "We can't let this continue," Bjorn said, his voice low and urgent. "Ivar's actions are alienating potential allies and turning the Saxons into implacable enemies. If we're not careful, we'll win the war only to lose everything in the peace that follows." Ubi nodded in agreement. "But how do we rein him in? You've seen how he is. He won't listen to reason." Bjorn's face was grim as he watched his youngest brother. "Then we may have to take more drastic measures, for the good of our people, and for the legacy of our father." As the great heathen army moved out, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok found themselves at a crossroads. They had come to England united in purpose, seeking vengeance for their father. But now, with that vengeance achieved and much of England under their control, old rivalries and new ambitions threatened to tear them apart. The conquest of England had been the easy part. Now the true test of the sons of Ragnar would begin. A test not of military might, but of leadership, wisdom, and the ability to control their own worst impulses. As they marched towards an uncertain future, the words of their father echoed in their minds. "How the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered." The old boar's suffering had been avenged, but the little piggy's grunting was far from over. The salty Mediterranean breeze whipped through Bjorn Ironside's beard as he stood at the prow of his longship. The coast of Sicily loomed on the horizon, a land his father Ragnar had only dreamed of reaching. Bjorn's eyes gleamed with the thrill of discovery and the weight of his father's legacy. "Land ho!" called the lookout from the crow's nest. Bjorn nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, father," he murmured to himself, "let's see if I can sail further than you ever did." As the Viking fleet approached the Sicilian shore, Bjorn gathered his captains for a council. Among them was Halfdan, his longtime friend and fellow adventurer. "We're in unknown waters now," Bjorn addressed the group. "The people here have never seen Vikings before. We must be cautious, but also seize any opportunity that presents itself." Halfdan grinned, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Caution? Since when has Bjorn Ironside been cautious?" Laughter rippled through the group, but Bjorn's expression remained serious. "Since we sailed beyond the edge of our maps, old friend. We're not here just to raid. We're here to explore, to trade, to make a name for ourselves that will echo through the ages." As Bjorn's fleet made landfall, the local population fled in terror. The Vikings found themselves in a world vastly different from the northern lands they knew. Marble temples, exotic fruits, and people with skin darkened by the southern sun all served to emphasize just how far they had come. Meanwhile, across the sea in England, Ivar the Boneless was carving out his own legend. The city of York had fallen to his cunning tactics, and he now sat upon its throne, a cruel and calculating ruler. In the great hall of York, Ivar held court, his twisted legs stretched out before him on a specially crafted throne. A group of Saxon nobles were brought before him, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. "Kneel before your new king," Ivar commanded, his voice soft, but laced with menace. One of the nobles, an older man with a proud bearing, stepped forward. "We will never kneel to a heathen cripple," he spat. Ivar's eyes narrowed, a dangerous smile playing across his lips. "Is that so?" He gestured to his guards. "Bring me his sons." The color drained from the noble's face as two young men were dragged into the hall. Ivar leaned forward, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Kneel, or watch them die." Slowly. The noble's resistance crumbled. He fell to his knees, followed quickly by the others. Ivar sat back, satisfaction evident in his cruel smirk. "See? Was that so difficult? Now let's discuss how you'll prove your loyalty to your new king." As Ivar consolidated his power in York, his brothers Ubi and Hvitserk found themselves adrift in the new world they had helped create. They had settled in East Anglia, trying to bridge the gap between Viking conquerors and Saxon subjects. Ubi stood on the walls of their stronghold, gazing out over the English countryside. Hvitserk joined him, a flagon of ale in hand. "Do you ever wonder if we made the right choice, brother?" Ubi asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Hvitserk took a long drink before answering. "Which choice? Coming to England? Splitting from Bjorn? Not opposing Ivar more strongly?" Uba sighed. "All of it. Sometimes I feel like we're caught between worlds, neither fully Viking nor truly rulers of this land." Hvitserk clapped his brother on the shoulder. "We're blazing a new trail, Ubi. It was never going to be easy. But think of the legacy we're building. Our children will rule here long after we're gone." As the brothers contemplated their future, a strange figure appeared in their court. An old man, wrapped in a traveler's cloak, with only one eye visible beneath his hood. He requested an audience with the sons of Ragnar, claiming to have wisdom to share. Ubi and Hvitserk received the stranger in their great hall, curiosity overcoming their initial suspicion. "Who are you, old man?" Hvitserk demanded. "And what wisdom could you possibly offer the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok?" The stranger's single eye seemed to pierce through them. "I have been known by many names," he replied cryptically, "but you may call me Wanderer. As for wisdom, I have walked the 9 worlds and seen the threads of fate. I know the challenges that lie ahead for the sons of Ragnar." Ubi leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Speak plainly, Wanderer. What challenges do you foresee?" The old man's voice took on a rhythmic quality, almost like a chant. "Brothers divided, a kingdom in strife, the eagle soars high, but beware its fall. From eastern lands comes a test of your might. Unite or perish, heed Odin's call." As the last words faded, a chill seemed to settle over the hall. Ubi and Hvitserk exchanged glances, a mixture of awe and unease in their eyes. "What does it mean?" Hvitserk asked, his earlier bravado gone. The Wanderer smiled mysteriously. "That is for you to discover, young princes. But know this. The choices you make in the coming days will shape the fate of your people for generations to come." With those words, the stranger turned and walked out of the hall, seeming to vanish into thin air once he passed the threshold. Ubi and Hvitserk were left to ponder the cryptic warning, but they didn't have long to dwell on it. Within days, a messenger arrived from the east, bearing news that would change everything. "My lords," the messenger gasped, out of breath from his long journey. "A new force has landed on our eastern shores. They call themselves the Rus, led by a warrior who claims to be a descendant of Odin himself." The brothers' blood ran cold. Could this be the threat the Wanderer had foreseen? "We must warn Bjorn," Ubi declared, "and, as much as it pains me to say it, we need Ivar. This is a threat to all of us." Hvitserk nodded grimly. "The sons of Ragnar must stand united once more." As ravens flew to carry messages to Bjorn in the Mediterranean and Ivar in York, the sons of Ragnar prepared to face their greatest challenge yet. The legacy of Ragnar Lothbrok hung in the balance, and the future of the Viking world with it. In Sicily, Bjorn received the news with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He gathered his men, his voice carrying over the assembled warriors. "My brothers, our time of exploration must come to an end. We are called back to defend our homeland. But fear not. The skills we have learned, the wonders we have seen, will serve us well in the battles to come. We return not as the same men who left, but as warriors tempered by distant lands and strange seas." A cheer went up from the Vikings, eager to return home and face this new challenge. In York, Ivar's reaction to the news was more measured. A cold smile played across his lips as he read the message from his brothers. "So," he mused aloud, "they need me after all. How fitting that it takes a threat to all we've built to bring the sons of Ragnar together once more." He turned to his most trusted advisor. "Prepare our forces. We march to meet this Rus threat. And when the dust settles, we shall see who truly deserves to rule." As the sons of Ragnar prepared to converge once more, the fate of their father's legacy hung in the balance. The coming conflict would test not only their strength and cunning, but also the bonds of brotherhood that had been stretched to the breaking point. The saga of the Lothbroks was far from over. In fact, it seemed that the greatest chapters were yet to be written. The clash of steel and the war cries of thousands filled the air as the sons of Ragnar faced their greatest challenge yet. The Rus army, led by the enigmatic Prince Oleg, had pushed deep into Viking territory, forcing the once divided brothers to unite in defense of their homeland. Bjorn Ironside, his face lined with the wisdom of his Mediterranean travels, stood atop a hill overlooking the battlefield. Beside him, Ivar the Boneless sat in his war chariot, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and calculation. "It's like Ragnarok itself has come upon us," Bjorn mused, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Ivar snorted. "Save your poetry, brother. We have a war to win." As they watched, the tide of battle seemed to turn against them. The Rus forces, with their superior numbers and unfamiliar tactics, were pushing the Viking lines back. Ubi, fighting in the thick of the melee, shouted to his brothers, "We can't hold them much longer. We need a plan." Bjorn's mind raced, weighing options and potential outcomes. In that moment, he felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down upon him. What would Ragnar do in this situation? Suddenly, a plan crystallized in his mind. It was audacious, perhaps even suicidal, but it might just work. "Ivar," Bjorn turned to his younger brother, "I need you to take command of our forces. Pull them back, make it look like we're retreating." Ivar's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And what will you be doing?" Bjorn's gaze was steady as he replied, "What our father would do, something unexpected." Before Ivar could protest, Bjorn was moving, gathering a small group of his most trusted warriors. They slipped away from the main battle, circling around to flank the Rus army. As Ivar directed the feigned retreat, he found himself studying the Rus leader, Prince Oleg. There was something familiar in the man's cunning tactics, something that resonated with Ivar's own strategic mind. For the first time in years, Ivar felt a twinge of doubt about his methods. He had always relied on brutality and fear to achieve his goals, but watching Oleg, he saw a leader who inspired loyalty through charisma and vision. "Perhaps," Ivar muttered to himself, "there is more than one way to be a king." As the battle raged on, Hvitserk fought his way to Ivar's side. "Where's Bjorn?" he shouted over the clash of weapons. Ivar's eyes never left the battlefield as he replied, "Our noble brother has decided to play the hero. Let's hope his gamble pays off, or we'll all be dining in Valhalla tonight." Hours passed, and the Viking forces continued their strategic retreat. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a mighty war cry rose from the Rus army's flank. Bjorn and his warriors had successfully circled behind enemy lines and were now cutting a swath of destruction through their rear guard. The Rus army, caught off guard by this unexpected assault, began to falter. Ivar, seizing the moment, bellowed orders for a full counterattack. The Viking forces surged forward, their spirits lifted by Bjorn's daring maneuver. As the sun began to set, the tide of battle had fully turned. The Rus army was in retreat, leaving behind a field strewn with the dead and dying. In the aftermath, the brothers gathered to assess their victory. Bjorn, bloodied but triumphant, approached Ivar. "Well, brother," Bjorn said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "It seems our father's blood runs true in both of us." Ivar nodded, a reluctant respect in his eyes. "Your plan was not entirely stupid. Perhaps there's hope for you yet, Ironside." But even as they reveled in their victory, a new challenge was emerging. Word spread through the camp of dissent among the Viking jarls. Many were questioning the leadership of Ragnar's sons, arguing that the old ways of rule by strength alone were no longer sufficient in this new world. Ubba, always the most politically savvy of the brothers, brought the news to Bjorn and Ivar. "The jarls are calling for a thing," he explained, referring to the traditional Viking assembly. "They want to establish a new system of governance, one where power is shared among the chieftains rather than concentrated in the hands of a single king." Ivar's face darkened with rage. Shared power. Have they lost their minds? We just saved them from annihilation. Bjorn, however, looked thoughtful. Perhaps they have a point. The world is changing, brothers. Maybe it's time our ways changed with it. Ivar turned on Bjorn, his eyes flashing dangerously. "You would give up everything our father built? Everything we've fought for?" "Not give up," Bjorn countered calmly. "Adapt. Grow. Isn't that what father always did?" As the brothers argued, a messenger arrived with urgent news. Prince Oleg, it seemed, was requesting a parley. The Rus leader proposed a treaty, one that would establish trade routes and a tentative peace between their peoples. The news sent shockwaves through the Viking camp. Some saw it as an opportunity for prosperity, others as a sign of weakness. The decision on how to respond would shape the future of their people. As night fell, Bjorn stood alone on the cliffs overlooking the sea, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. The one-eyed wanderer they had encountered before the battle appeared beside him, seeming to materialize out of the mist. "The twilight of the gods approaches, son of Ragnar." The wanderer's voice was like gravel. "The old ways are fading. What will you build in their place?" Bjorn turned to question the mysterious figure, but he had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. In the days that followed, tensions among the brothers reached a breaking point. Ivar, unwilling to accept any diminishment of his power, began to plot in secret. He reached out to disaffected jarls, promising them wealth and influence in exchange for their support. Bjorn, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to broker a compromise between the old ways and the new. He proposed a council of chieftains, with the sons of Ragnar serving as first among equals rather than absolute rulers. The night before the thing was to be held, Vitzerk overheard Ivar's conspirators discussing their plans. Torn between loyalty to his brother and the future of his people, Vitzerk made a fateful decision. As the thing began, with Vikings from all across the land gathering to decide their future, Vitzerk stepped forward. His voice rang out clear and strong as he exposed Ivar's plot to seize power. The assembly erupted into chaos. Ivar, his plans in tatters, turned on Vitzerk with murderous rage. "Traitor!" he screamed, launching himself from his chariot at his brother. Bjorn and Ubba intervened, restraining Ivar as the jarls called for his imprisonment. In that moment, the legacy of Ragnar Lothbrok hung by a thread. The unity of the brothers, which had seen them through so many trials, was shattered. As Ivar was led away, hurling curses and threats, Bjorn addressed the assembled Vikings. "My father, Ragnar Lothbrok, dreamed of a future where our people would be more than just raiders and warriors. He saw a world where Vikings could be explorers, traders, builders of great kingdoms. Today, we stand at a crossroads. We can cling to the old ways and watch our world crumble around us, or we can forge a new path. A hush fell over the crowd as Bjorn continued, I propose we embrace change. Let us create a council of chieftains where every voice can be heard. Let us seek peace and prosperity through trade, as well as strength in battle. This is how we will honor Ragnar's legacy and secure our people's future. The thing erupted into heated debate. Some voices called for a return to the old ways. Others championed Bjorn's vision of a new future. As the arguments raged, the sons of Ragnar exchanged glances, each knowing that whatever the outcome, their world would never be the same. As the sun set on that fateful day, the Viking world stood on the brink of transformation. The twilight of the gods had indeed come, and with it, the dawn of a new era. The legacy of Ragnar Lothbrok would live on, not in conquest and bloodshed, but in the wisdom and adaptability of his sons. But even as a new future beckoned, old grudges smoldered. Ivar, imprisoned but unbowed, plotted his revenge. The saga of the Lothbroks was far from over, and the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The air crackled with tension as the sons of Ragnar gathered for what they knew would be their final battle. The rolling hills of Kattegat, once a symbol of Viking power and prosperity, now stood as the last bastion against a world rapidly changing around them. Bjorn Ironside, his face weathered by years of leadership and conflict, gazed out at the assembled warriors. Beside him stood Ubi and Vitsark, their expressions grim with the weight of what was to come. Brothers, Bjorn began, his voice carrying across the throng. Today we fight not just for our lives, but for the very soul of our people. The world is changing, and we must change with it or be swept away by the tides of time. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Change was a concept that sat uneasily with many Vikings, who clung to the old ways like a lifeline in stormy seas. Ubi stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the warriors. We face enemies from without and within. The Christian kingdoms press at our borders, and our own people question the path we must take. But remember, we are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. His blood runs in our veins, and his wisdom guides our hands. As if summoned by the mention of their father's name, a figure emerged from the crowd. The one-eyed wanderer who had appeared to them in times of great need now stood before the brothers, his single eye gleaming with an otherworldly light. You speak of Ragnar's wisdom, the wanderer's voice rasped. But do you truly know your father's fate? The secrets he carried to his grave? A hush fell over the assembly. Bjorn's eyes narrowed as he studied the mysterious figure. Speak plainly, old man. What secrets do you claim to know? The wanderer's laugh was like stone grinding against stone. Ragnar Lothbrok did not die in King Ella's snake pit, as you all believe. His death was a ruse, a final gambit in a game that spans generations. Gasps and exclamations of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Vitsark pushed forward, his face a mask of confusion and anger. What madness is this? We avenged our father's death, the great heathen army. Was exactly what Ragnar intended. The wanderer cut him off. Your father saw further than any of you could imagine. He knew that for the Vikings to survive, they had to evolve. The age of raiding and pillaging was coming to an end. A new world was dawning, one of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Bjorn's mind reeled as he processed this information. Could it be true? Had their entire quest for vengeance been part of some greater plan? Before he could question further, a commotion arose from the edge of the gathering. Warriors parted to reveal Ivar the Boneless, somehow freed from his imprisonment, dragging himself forward with a wild look in his eyes. Lies, Ivar spat, his face contorted with rage. Our father was a warrior, a conqueror. He would never abandon our ways for some weak vision of peace. The wanderer turned his penetrating gaze on Ivar. And yet, here you are, Ivar the Boneless, the most ruthless of Ragnar's sons, brought low by the very brutality you championed. Your father foresaw this too. He knew that the old ways would eventually destroy themselves. Ivar's face paled, his certainty shaken for the first time in memory. No, it can't be. As the revelations hung heavy in the air, horns sounded in the distance. The enemy was approaching, a combined force of Christian kingdoms united against what they saw as the last great pagan threat. Bjorn snapped into action, pushing aside his shock to focus on the immediate danger. To arms, brothers. Whatever the truth of our father's fate, we must defend our people. As the Vikings rushed to take up defensive positions, the Wanderer's voice carried over the din. Remember, sons of Ragnar, the true battle is not won with swords and axes, but with wisdom and foresight. Your father's legacy lives on in the choices you make today. The battle that followed was unlike any the Vikings had ever faced. It was not just a clash of armies, but a collision of worlds. The old pagan ways of the North against the advancing tide of Christianity and feudalism. In the thick of the fighting, Bjorn found himself face to face with King Alfred of Wessex, the Christian ruler who had once been an ally, but now led the charge against them. It doesn't have to end this way, Bjorn, Alfred shouted over the clash of steel. There can be peace between our peoples. Bjorn parried a blow, his mind racing. And what kind of peace would that be, Alfred? One where we abandon everything we are? Alfred's eyes blazed with conviction. Not abandon, evolve. The world is changing, Bjorn. You must change with it or be left behind. As they fought, Bjorn realized with a start that Alfred's words echoed those of the Wanderer, and indeed his own thoughts in recent years. Could this be what Ragnar had foreseen? Across the battlefield, Ivar found himself in a different kind of struggle. Surrounded by enemies, his physical limitations more apparent than ever, he felt the futility of his lifelong pursuit of power through brutality. In a moment of clarity, Ivar saw the path his father had tried to set them on. Not one of endless conquest, but of adaptation and growth. With a roar of frustration and revelation, Ivar turned his tactical genius to a new purpose. "Brothers," he shouted, his voice carrying across the chaos. "Fall back to the Great Hall. I have a plan." Surprised by this sudden shift, but trusting in Ivar's strategic mind, the Vikings began a fighting retreat. As they barricaded themselves in the Great Hall of Kattegat, Ivar laid out a daring proposal. "We offer them a treaty," he said, his eyes gleaming with the old fire, but tempered now with something new. "Not as defeated foes, but as equals. We bring our strength, our seafaring skills, our trade networks. In return, we gain protection under their laws, the freedom to keep our beliefs while adapting to the new world." Ubi looked at his brother in astonishment. "Ivar, are you feeling well? This doesn't sound like you at all." Ivar's laugh was tinged with both bitterness and hope. "Perhaps I'm finally becoming the son our father always hoped I could be." As the Christian forces surrounded the Great Hall, prepared for a final assault, Bjorn made his decision. He strode out alone, his weapons sheathed, to face King Alfred. "We propose a treaty," Bjorn's voice rang out clear and strong. "Not surrender but alliance. The age of Vikings as you know us may be ending, but our spirit, our strength, and our wisdom can help build a new world, one that bridges the old and the new." Alfred, surprised by this turn of events, lowered his sword. "And your brothers? Do they stand with you in this?" One by one, Ubi, Hvitserk, and finally Ivar emerged from the Great Hall, standing united for the first time in years. "We are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok," Ubi declared, "and we choose to honor our father's true legacy, not one of endless war, but of vision, adaptability, and progress." As negotiations began, the one-eyed Wanderer appeared once more, standing on the outskirts of the gathering. He nodded once, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, before vanishing into the mists of legend. In the years that followed, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons took on new meaning. The great Viking king was remembered not just as a warrior and conqueror, but as a visionary who saw the turning of ages and prepared his people for the future. The sons of Ragnar, once divided by ambition and ideology, became the architects of a new Norse identity. Bjorn's diplomatic skills, Ivar's tactical genius, Ubi's political acumen, and Vitserk's adaptability all played crucial roles in navigating the turbulent waters of change. Viking longships, once the terror of coastal settlements, became the backbone of a vast trading network that spanned from the fjords of Norway to the markets of Constantinople. Norse warriors, their fighting skills legendary, found new purpose as elite guardsmen in courts across Europe. As the old gods faded into memory, replaced by the new god of the Christians, the spirit of the Vikings lived on. Their love of exploration, their fierce independence, and their ability to adapt in the face of adversity became their true lasting legacy. And so, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok came to an end, not with the clash of swords or the burning of cities, but with the birth of a new era. An era shaped by the wisdom of a father who saw beyond his time, and the courage of sons who dared to redefine their destiny. As the last words of the saga were recorded by the skalds, a question lingered in the minds of all who heard it. Had this been Ragnar's plan all along? The answer, like the man himself, would remain a mystery, debated and pondered for generations to come.